Hey crew, it's Pitt and I am back with some more Esoterica. Today we're diving back into the works of Mrs. Helena Blavatsky. This is the Secret Doctrine. We are reading aloud and discussing as we go along the various points that are brought to light by the text. It is not the format for everyone, but people find value in it, so you are more than welcome to tag along as we continue our exploration. Before we begin, however, if you are unfamiliar with me, any of my unconventional beliefs, or if at any point in time I lose you in terminology, there will be several playlists linked in the corner above, in the box down below, along with the original source material, so that you can get a better understanding of who I am and why I say the things that I do. With that being said, we are going to dive in and continue our exploration of the Secret Doctrine with Part 2, Stanza 6, The Evolution of Sweat. This is a long one, so I'm going to try and keep my commentary to a minimum as best as I can. Sometimes I just can't help myself. 22. Then the second evolved, the sweat-born, the third race. The sweat grew, its drops grew, and the drops became hard and round. The sun warmed it, the moon cooled and shaped it, the wind fed it until its ripeness. The white swan from the starry vault, the moon, overshadowed the big drop, the egg of the future race, the man swan, Hamsa, of the later third. First, male, female, then man and woman. Now, to me, this is not, like this first part right here, the second evolved, the sweat born, the third, and the sweat grew. Like, we came out of a vapor into sweat, right? This is the condensation of the universe. This is the formation of the planets being explained the best way that it can. At least this first part, right? This right here, at least is talking about the planet and not people. Now, this part can be taken as talking about people because, I mean, it mentions man and woman. But this part right here, this is talking about the planet. You are not round. You are not hard. People are not round or hard unless they are severely afflicted with obesity, right? This is not correct. And so this is talking about the planet, not people. Now, this second part, the white swan from the vault overshadowed the big drop. Okay, we got a moon. Now, more than likely, the moon was here after the Earth. It is a piece of the Earth that was most probably knocked off. Check out the rest of this study if you're confused by that. The egg of the future race, the thing that contains the future race. Now, the man swan, that's a little bit hard of an allegory, I get it, of the later third. First, male, female, and then man, woman. So this is saying overshadowed to the big drop, the egg of the future race, right? Not the race we are creating now, right? But contained within this round thing is the germ that will become humanity. That's how I read this. I am positive that is not how she reads it. A. The text of the stanza clearly implies that the human embryo was nourished ab extra by cosmic forces, and that the father-mother furnished, apparently, the germ that ripened. In all probability, a sweat-born egg to be hatched out in some mysterious way, disconnected from the double parent. It is comparatively easy to conceive of an oviparous humanity, since even now man is in one sense egg-born. And not in one sense, unequivocally. You are born from the egg of a woman. It's just not gestated into a capsule that has been laid and sat upon, right? The sperm enters the ovum, which is the egg. McGindy, moreover, in his Précis élémentaire de physiologie, citing a case where the umbilical cord was ruptured and perfectly citrized, yet the infant was born alive, pertinently asked, how was the circulation carried on in this organ? On the next page he says, nothing is at present known respecting the use of digestion in the fetus, and respecting its nutrition, propounds this query. What, then, can we say of the nutrition of the fetus? Physiological works contain only vague conjectures at this point. Ah, but the skeptic may urge. McGinty's book belongs to the last generation, and science has since made such strides that his stigma of ignorance can no longer be fixed upon the profession. Now, as far as I am aware, if the umbilical cord ruptures, that is going to lead to severe problems for the baby. So it is entirely possible that at the time of birth, like sometimes the umbilical cord wraps around the neck or gets bound up in other ways. Maybe on the way out it ruptured and that led to not having serious detrimental effects. But for the most part, as far as I am aware, if there is a week where there's a bust umbilical cord, the baby is going to die. Right? In that instance, today, we would do a cesarean. Right? They would automatically, immediately, as soon as they knew about it, go in and try to save that child's life. And so, for me, I'm going to say that this is a single instance. Right? I don't have the evidence, but it probably is, and they took it to mean, well, if this happened, then everything will be fine. Like, at this point in science, there were many things that were still debatable, right? This was probably one of those. But I don't think that by any stretch of the imagination that we can say that it would be perfectly fine for babies not to have umbilical cords, right? They aren't fed some other way. Their circulation doesn't get done some other way. It is literally a direct connection. Their nutrition comes directly from their mother. So, indeed. Then, let us turn to a very great authority upon physiology, vis-a-vis Sir M. Foster. Textbook of Physiology, 3rd edition, 1879. And to the disadvantage of modern science, we shall find him saying, concerning the rise and development of the functional activities of the embryo, our knowledge is almost a blank. We know scarcely anything about the various steps by which the primary fundamental qualities of the protoplasm of the ovum are differentiated into the complex phenomena which we have attempted in this book to explain. The students of Trinity College, Canterbury, will now kindly draw a veil before the statue of Hygeia and bandage the eyes of the bust of Galen and Hippocrates, lest they look reproachfully at their degenerate descendants. One further fact we must note. Sir M. Foster is discreetly silent about the case of the ruptured umbilical cord cited by his great French confrère. One instance does not make a rule. There is always an exception to a rule, and the rule is that the umbilical cord ruptures, it is death. This is a very curious statement, as explained in the commentaries. To make it clear, the first race, having created the second by budding, as just explained, the second race gives birth to the third, which itself is separated into 3 distinct divisions, consisting of men differently procreated. The first 2 of these are produced by an oviparous method, presumably unknown to modern natural history, and still, somehow, mysteriously, completely unknown. While the early sub-races of the third humanity procreated their species by a kind of exudation of moisture or vital fluid, the drops of which, coalescing, formed an oviform ball, or shall we say egg, which served as an extraneous vehicle for the generation therein of fetus and child. The mode of procreation by the later races changed, in its results at all events. And again, to me, that stanza does not talk about one race creating another race. It is talking about the formation of the planet from the planetary materials that were formerly vaporous. The little ones of the earlier races were entirely sexless, shapeless, even for all one knows. Shapeless even for all one knows. Footnote. See the Timaeus. Once again, we have done Timaeus, and once again, this is not in there. But in the Ancient Lore playlist, we have Timaeus done. You can look it up by itself, but Those of the later races were born androgynous. So they were sexless, and then they became both sexes, and then that split into two sexes. Makes perfect sense. It is in the third race that the separation of sexes occurred. From being previously asexual, humanity became distinctly hermaphrodite or bisexual. And finally, the man-bearing eggs began to give birth, gradually and almost imperceptibly in their evolutionary development. First, to beings in which one sex predominated over the other, and finally to distinct men and women. And now, let us search for corroboration to these statements in the religious legends of East and West. Let us take the egg-born race first. Think of Kasyapa, the Vedic sage, the most prolific of creators. He was the son of Marichi, Brahma's mind-born son, and he is made to become the father of the Nagas, or serpents, among other beings. Exoterically, the Nagas are semi-divine beings which have a human face and the tail of a serpent. Yet, there was a race of the Nagas said to be 1,000 in number only, born, or rather sprung from, Kadra, Kasyapa's wife, for the purpose of peopling Patala, which is undeniably America, as will be shown. I'm looking forward to that. And there was a Nagdvipa, one of the 7 divisions of Bharata Varasha, India, inhabited by a people bearing the same name, who were allowed, even by some Orientalists, to be historical, and to have left many a trace behind them, even to this day. Now, the point most insisted upon at present is that, whatever origin be claimed for man, his evolution took place in this order. 1. Sexless, as at all the earlier forms are. 2. Then, by natural transition, he became a solitary hermaphrodite, a bisexual being. There is no natural transition from asexual to both sexuals and then to semisexual or single sexual. That's just not going to work. There's no biological imperative for that. And 3, finally separated and become what he is now. Science teaches us that all the primitive forms, though sexless, still retain the power of undergoing the process of asexual multiplication. Why, then, should man be excluded from the law of nature? Bisexual reproduction is an evolution, a specialized and perfected form on the scale of matter of the Physiopatous act of reproduction. And somehow it has managed to work its way into every single species on the planet, with a couple of exceptions. Occult teachings are preeminently panspermic, and the early history of humanity is hidden only from ordinary mortals, nor is the history of the primitive races buried from the initiates in the tomb of time, as it is for profane science. Therefore, supported on the one hand by that science which shows to us progressive development and an internal cause for every external modification, as a law in nature, and, on the other hand, by an implicit faith in the wisdom, we may say pansophia even, of the universal traditions gathered and preserved by the initiates, who have protected them into an almost faultless system. Thus supported, we venture to state the doctrine clearly. In an able article written some 15 years ago, our learned and respected friend, Professor Alex Wilder of New York, shows the absolute logic and necessity of believing the primeval race of double-sexed, and gives a number of scientific reasons for it. See extracts from that essay in The Theosophist of February of 1883. He argues, firstly, that a large part of the vegetable creation exhibits the phenomena of bisexuality, the Linnaean classification enumerating thus almost all plants. This is the case of the superior families of the vegetable kingdom as much as in the lower forms, from the hemp to the Lombardy poplar and Ailanthus. Now, I don't know about the Lombardy poplar. I don't know about ailanthus, but I do know about this one. Both hemp and its close cousin, cannabis, have a male and female plant. They are not bisexual. You have a male plant that produces the pollen. You have a female plant that accepts the pollen. The buds, the part that you use if you are using the medicine that it comes from this plant, is female entirely. Now, due to extreme stress during the cloning process, you can cause problems with that, right? You can make a plant hermaphroditic through extreme stress, right? This is something that I know because I did it by accident. And so I know that it is possible, but it is not the rule at all. Most of the time, it is a male and a female plant, except under extreme stress caused by artificial circumstances. Back to the text. In the animal kingdom, in insect life, the moth generates a worm. As in the mysteries, the great secret was expressed. Taurus dracronum genuit et taurum draco. The coral-producing family. I don't understand what this means, though. Like, in the animal kingdom, in insect life, the moth generates a worm. What does that have to do with bisexuality? What does that have to do with asexuality? Absolutely nothing. It gives birth to the pupae which it was designed to give birth to. There is a process that happens. That is true. There is a change entirely, a metamorphosis. But this is entirely how it is supposed to be, and it is produced by a male and a female butterfly or moth. That is literally how this works. And so I don't understand what this reference is even for, right? This is not reinforcing her point at all. The coral-producing family, which, according to Agassiz, has spent many hundreds of thousands of years during the present geological period in building the peninsula of Florida. Well, that's interesting. Produce their offspring from themselves like the buds and ramifications in a tree. Bees are somewhat in the same line. No, they're not. The aphids or plant lice keep house like Amazons, and virgin parents perpetuate the race for 10 successive generations. All right, so this is an aphid or plant life, right? I'm not familiar with the generation, again, of aphids. It is possible that they are asexual, but I don't think so. But bees are not at all along the same line. Once again, we have the lens of history and greater knowledge to fall back upon. And one of the things that I'm interested in that I don't get to participate in because of where I live is beekeeping. Like, I watch videos of other people keeping bees all of the time. And if you didn't know, I'm going to let you know something. Bees lay eggs, and those eggs are fertilized by male of the species. Now, you normally don't see the males. They are drones. They are kept fed and happy just so that they can lay the pipe where they need to. Much like the queen. If you are seeing the drones or if you are seeing the queen, you are disrupting the hive. You are doing something outside of natural limits to be able to see these things. The drones don't go out and fly around and collect pollen. They're there simply to fertilize these eggs, of which thousands are laid every single year. And so these do not reproduce by buds. That is just simply a fact. And again, that is one of the things, you don't have to like the facts, right? They exist whether you like them or not. They are true whether you like them or not. Bees do not reproduce by budding. That is just simply, that does not happen. And honestly, the slightest bit of observation, right? There were apiaries then. People were beekeeping then. How is this not common knowledge then? Wow. Now, again, I don't know about aphids, right? I know aphids exist. I know what the purpose they serve. I know that they're even farmed by other animals. I don't know whether they have male or female. I've never dug into it that deep, but I'm going to assume that they do. Back to the text. What say the old sages, the philosopher teachers of antiquity? Aristophanes speaks thus on the subject in Plato's Banquet. All nature of old was not the same as it is now. It was androgynous, the form and name partaking of and being common to both the male and female. Their bodies were round, in the manner of their running circular. Okay, let's check that out. Compare Ezekiel's vision of the four divine beings who had the likeness of a man, and yet had the appearance of a wheel. When they went, they went upon their four sides, for the spirit of the living creatures was in the wheel. You can fall back to the Bible study where we discuss this in some extensive detail, right? It is entirely possible that there is a foreign race of beings that live on the planet. Entities, to me, are real. That does not mean that they created you. That doesn't. It means that they are existent. It doesn't mean that ants created you, that they exist. It doesn't mean that butterflies created you because they exist. It doesn't mean that fire even created you because it exists. I believe that these elementals do exist. I believe that the angels and demons do exist. And if they do exist, maybe they are on a different level than us. But that does not mean, by any stretch of the imagination, that they have to look like us, to comport themselves like us, or that they generated us. You can make that assumption, and more probably, somewheres in the annals of time, one of these entities, probably not aligned for the betterment of humankind, convinced some people that they did indeed create them, maybe for reasons. Back to the text. They were terrible in force and strength and had prodigious ambition. Hence, Zeus divided each of them into two, making them weaker. Apollo, under his direction, closed up the skin. And again, once more, this is all speculation. This was someone speculating about creation long after it had occurred. It was not somebody at the moment of creation writing down what happened. There was no recorder sitting next to Zeus when he made the decision to divide these androgynine people into two sexes. Right? Now, I understand that our legends say that these things have happened. That doesn't make them true. They have to stand up to tests. And one of those tests is evidentiary. We do not have any fossil records of this transition. We don't have any fossil records of macroevolution, man evolving from one of the apes, whichever one is the current thesis, into humans. We do not have that missing link. It is completely missing from the entirety of the fossil record. We don't have it. We do not have any evidence whatsoever that at any point in time, humanity's default state was androgyny. We do not have that evidence anywheres. We have skeletal remains from 20,000 years ago, and they do not even imply that this was a thing. Now, do we have skeletal remains from 20 million years ago? Not to my awareness. That doesn't mean that it ain't possible. The Smithsonian and the Vatican have a lot of things. There may be somewhere existent a community that has been found of androgynous people. But as far as I'm aware, that is not a thing and has never been a thing. And so, it is fine to speculate upon things. Speculate upon the creation of the humanity as much as you want. Doesn't make it fact because you speculate upon it. It does not make it fact that somebody believed it enough to write it down. We have people still today that write down every single day that the earth is flat. Every single day. Like, I got people that I know in real life that believe that the earth is flat. Fully, firmly convicted that we have never left the planet. That satellites don't exist. All of these things are verifiably untrue. Like, we can literally, like, you can get a telescope and a laser and point it at the moon to a specific area where we have attached a mirror for scientific experimentation, right? You can quite literally find the mirror that we placed on the moon, and people will tell you that's not real. So crazy. So crazy. And it is because people write down things that they believed in, right? Somebody wrote down that there was a firmament, and now you will not convince anybody that it is different, despite the fact that the Bible is self-contradictory all the way through it. Like, all the way through it. It contradicts itself quite often within the same chapter of the same book. It's wild. It really is. Back to the text. Mashiach and Mishiane were but a single individual with the old Persians. They also taught that man was the product of the tree of life, growing in androgynous pairs till they were separated at a subsequent modification of the human form. Footnote. It is important to note again that according to Mrs. Blavatsky, right, according to the first book of this study, The Secret Doctrine, right, we're in book 2. In the first book, a large portion of that book was devoted to proving that the Persians got their beliefs from the Hindus. And so, if the Hindus believe this thing and the Persians got their beliefs from the Hindus, it would naturally follow that they would believe the same thing. Right? With environmental changes, with adapting for yourself, you're still going to believe basically the same thing. What do you know? They believe what the Hindus believe. She also makes the argument that the Egyptians got what their beliefs were from the Hindus. Is it a surprise that they accord? She also believes that the Greeks got their ideas from the Hindus. Is it a strange thing, if that is a true thing, that it would be the same? Now, I believe that there can be a common cause. It may even be the Hindus. Probably even is. That doesn't mean they got it right. That means that they wrote it down. That means that they believed it enough to commit it to forever. Does not make it correct. The correctness is the part that I'm concerned about. I don't care what you believe. You can believe that there's a firmament and that we can't get through it. It makes no difference in my life if you believe that. But I want people to operate in factual information, things that can be evidentially proven, right? We can prove that the moon is separate from the planet, even though the materials are pretty close to the same. We can prove that we have been to space. We can prove that the Earth is round, right? Without having to go to space. You can quite literally set up the experiment yourself to test the length of a shadow at the same time in different parts of the globe. You can quite literally yourself communicate with a friend on a phone, and both of you get a stick that is 12 inches long, stick it in the ground, and at high noon on midsummer measure the length of that shadow in both places. It will not be the same. Even if you're on the same latitude, right? Latitude runs top to bottom, longitude runs around the side. Even if you're on the same latitude, the same meridian, if you're in Chicago and Louisiana, which are on the same meridian, the Chicago will have a different size shadow cast by that stick than we have in Louisiana. That's only 400 miles different, 600 miles different, something like that. We can do it. Like, you can literally get on the phone. You can video it and prove it. And people will just dismiss that. I want us to operate in facts. Even on the stuff, like, I speculate about some wild stuff, y'all. Like, even the entities things, I speculate that those are real. I believe that those are real. But I keep it in the realm of speculation because I can't grab one and bring it here to show you. Operate upon things which are provable. Even the wild things, right? I believe in magic. I am trying to make it in a way that you can replicate it so that we can prove it is real. That is where I'm at. Back to the text. Oh wait, we didn't even check out the footnote. Footnote 2. See Professor Wilder's essay, The Primeval Race Double-Sexed. In the Toleduth generation of Adam, the verse, God created, bara, brought forth, man in his image. In the image of God created he him, male and female created he him, if read esoterically, will yield the true sense. The Elohim, gods, brought forth from themselves, by modification, man in their image. That is, again, like this part right here, this is true, right? This word in the scripture literally means plurality of gods. That is a truth. But this next part that she inserted is not contained in the text, nor even intimated. Like, there is not even a hint that this is what is in the text. And if that is confusing to you, we walk through Genesis. We spent an awful lot of time in Genesis. We did word studies in Genesis that we didn't even bother with in some of the later places. We did word studies. And this is not in there. Brought forth from themselves, by modification, man in their image, created they him, collective humanity, or Adamu. Male and female created he, collective deity, them. Footnote 3. Eusebius, a Christian, and the rabbis Samuel, Manasseh, Ben Israel, and Maimonides taught that Adam had two faces and one person, and from the beginning he was both male and female, male on one side and female on the other, like Manu's Brahma. But afterwards the parts were separated. That is not contained in the Bible, right? It can be extra-biblical. It can be in the Kabbalah, which it probably is. Again, doesn't make it true. The 139th Psalm of David, recited by Rabbi Jeremiah ben Eleazar, is evidence of this. Thou hast fashioned me behind and before. What? Not beset, as in the Bible, which is absurd and meaningless. And this shows, as Professor Wilder thinks, that the primeval form of mankind was androgynous. That does not say that. Like, even if it is saying that we were fashioned out of something else, which is not what it is saying, fashioned me behind and before does not mean male and female. It means front and back, right? Behind and before does not mean that there was two faces. That is an extrapolation that you are pulling completely out of your yang. That is not... Bruh. This will show the esoteric point. The sexless race was their first production, a modification of and from themselves. The pure spiritual existences. And this was Adam Solus. Thence came the second race, Adam Eve, or Yod-Heva, inactive and androgynes, and finally the third, or the separating hermaphrodite, Cain and Abel, who produced the fourth, Seth, Enos, etc. And again, this is a misrepresentation of what, like, I don't hold the Bible as the pure moral authority or even a good historical authority. There is good history in there. That doesn't make it an authority. This is not what is stated, right? This is not what is contained in the book. It may be, again, in the Kabbalah, but that's kept hidden, and you have to be initiated into it, so it is not good knowledge. This is not what is stated, right? It never says that Cain and Abel were hermaphrodites. It says that one of them tilled the field and one of them raised animals. It tells you that despite the fact that later in the exact same book, we are told that, hey, you just survived a flood. We're going to allow you to eat meat now. And if that is a real thing, right, if the Bible is this infallible source, then why were they hurting animals if they weren't allowed to eat them? That might be a problem for things, right? Cain and Abel were in two different professions, and there's a whole explanation as to why one was accepted and the other, right? It has to do with intentionality. It does not at any point in time say that Cain and Abel were a hermaphrodite, nor does it say that they produced Seth. They did. That is not what happens. Cain kills Abel, and then Adam and Eve do the thing and create Seth, who finds a wife. Back to the text. It is that third, the last semi-spiritual race, which was also the last vehicle of the divine and innate wisdom, ingenerate in the Enochs, the seers of that mankind. The fourth, which had tasted from the fruit of the tree of good and evil, wisdom united already to earthy and therefore impure intelligence. There is a footnote here, but before we get to it, it is important to note that if Adam and Eve were the first and Cain and Abel was the second, and they created Seth and Enoch, who was the third, that is after the tree of good and evil had already been eaten. Before Cain and Abel, they had eaten of the tree. Before Seth was a thing, they had eaten of the tree. Before they were cast out of Eden, they had eaten from the tree. So to say that it was the fourth that ate from the tree is a bit of a stretch. You're just completely dismissing the source material that you are using. That is wild to me. Footnote 4. See the union of Kokma, wisdom, and Bina, intelligence, or Jehovah, the demiurge, called understanding in the Proverbs of Solomon, chapter 7. Unto men wisdom, divine occult wisdom, crieth, O ye simple, understand wisdom, and ye fools, be of an understanding heart. It is spirit and matter, the nous and the psyche of the latter, which St. James says that it is earthly, sensual, and devilish. And their wisdom united already to earthy, and therefore impure intelligence, had consequently to acquire that wisdom by initiation and great struggle. And, and in the union of wisdom and intelligence, the former ruling the latter, is called in the Hermetic books the God possessing the double fecundity of the two sexes. That is not saying the same thing. Mystically, Jesus was held to be man-woman. See also in the Orphic hymns sung during the mysteries, we find Zeus is a male, Zeus is an immortal maid. The Egyptian Ammon was the goddess Neith in his other half. Jupiter has female breasts. Venus is bearded in some of her statues, and Ela, the goddess, is also Sudayoma, the god, as Vayavsavata's progeny. The name Adam, says Professor A. Wilder, or man, itself implies this double form of existence. It is identical with Athamas, or Thomas, Tamil Tam, which is rendered by the Greek Didymus, a twin. If, therefore, the first woman was formed subsequently to the first man, she must, as a logical necessity, be taken out of man, and the side which the Elohim had taken from man made he a woman. The Hebrew word here used is tzala, which bears the translation we have given. It is easy to trace the legend in Berosus, who says that Tahalatot, the Amaraka, the lady of Urka, was the beginning of creation. She was also Merlita, the queen of the moon. The two twin births of Genesis, that of Cain and Abel, again, not what is stated, and of Esau and Jacob, shadow the same idea. Right? At no point in time are we even insinuated that Cain and Abel were twins. Again, it may be contained in the Kabbalah, but that is not the common knowledge, right? That is not what is put in the book that everybody is supposed to read. At all. It does not say they are twins, even though it would be beneficial in this context, right? If this were true, Why not just put it in the book? Why not say that they were twins? They don't. There's a lot out of this. Like, this is, again, reading something that you want, right? Adam is not identical with a Thomas or Thomas. It's not. It is not the Greek dadumos. It is not. That is not what Adam is. Like, literally, the words aren't the same. The name, Abel, is the same as Eve. No, it's not. And its characteristics seem to be feminine. Continues the author. Until thee shall be his desire, said the Lord God to Cain, and thou shalt rule over him. That was not said to Cain. The same language had been uttered to Eve. Thy desires shall be to thy husband, and he shall rule over thee. Thus, the pristine bisexual unity of the human third root race is an axiom in the secret doctrine. That's why we're not going to listen to that. Its virgin individuals were raised to gods because that race represented their divine dynasty. The moderns are satisfied with worshiping the male heroes of the fourth race, who created gods after their own sexual image, whereas the gods of the primeval mankind were male and female. We talked about that yesterday. As stated in Book 1, the humanities developed coordinately and on parallel lines with the four elements, every new race being physiologically adapted to meet the additional element. Our fifth race is rapidly approaching the fifth element. Call it interstellar ether, if you will, which has more to do, however, with psychology than with physics. We men have learned to live in every climate, whether frigid or tropical, but the first two races had naught to do with climate, nor were they subservient to any temperature or change therein. And thus, we are taught, men lived down to the close of the third root race, when eternal spring reigned over the whole globe, such as is now enjoyed by the inhabitants of Jupiter. A world, says Mr. Flammarion, which is not subject like our own to the vicissitudes of seasons, wrong, nor to the abrupt alternations of temperatures, wrong, but which is enriched with all the treasures of eternal spring. The lens of history is a good one. Those astronomers who maintain that Jupiter is in a molten condition, in our sense of the term, are invited to settle their dispute with this learned French astronomer. Footnote. An hypothesis evolved in 1881 by Mr. Matthew Williams seems to have impressed astronomers but little. Says the author of The Fuel of the Sun in Knowledge, December 23, 1881. Applying now the researches of Dr. Andrews to the conditions of solar existence, I conclude that the sun has no nucleus, either solid, liquid, or gaseous, but is composed of dissociated matter in the critical state, surrounded first by a flaming envelope, due to the recombination of the dissociated matter, and outside of this by another envelope of vapors due to this combination. This is a novel theory to be added to other hypotheses, all scientific and orthodox. The meaning of the critical state is explained by Mr. M. Williams in the same journal, December 9th of 1881, in an article on solids, liquids, and gases. Speaking of an experiment by Dr. Andrews on carbonic acid, the scientist says that when 88 degrees is reached, the boundary between liquid and gas vanished. Liquid and gas have blended into one mysterious intermediate fluid. An indefinite fluctuating something is there, filling the whole of the tube, an etherealized liquid or visible gas. Hold a red-hot poker between your eye and the light, and you will see an upflowing wave of movement of what appears like liquid air. The appearance of the hybrid fluid in the tube resembles this, but it is sensibly denser, and evidently stands between the liquid and gaseous states of matter, as pitch or treacle stands between solid and liquid. The temperature at which this occurs has been named by Dr. Andrews the critical temperature. Here, the gaseous and liquid states are continuous. and it is probable that all other substances capable of existing in both states have their own particular critical temperatures. Yes, that is true. Speculating further upon this critical state, Mr. Matthew Williams admits some quite occult theories about Jupiter and other planets. He says, "Our notions of solids, liquids, and gases are derived from our experiences of the state of matter here upon this Earth. Could we be removed to another planet, they would be curiously changed. On Mercury, water would rank as one of the condensable gases. On Mars as a fusible solid. But what on Jupiter? There is no reason to believe any of that, right? And it is provably untrue. Water would rank as one of the condensable gases is not correct, right? Now, solid, liquid, and gas are quite literally just relative terms, right? You can take oxygen and hydrogen, and through pressure, you can condense them into liquid. That liquid can then have heat further removed from it, and removing that heat further will change that liquid into a solid. It is an interchangeable thing relative to the pressure and temperature of the material. That is true for every material. If you apply enough heat to anything, it will reach a point of melting, right? Sometimes, though, that heat is extensive, right? Iron is a really good heat sink. It takes an awful lot of heat to get it to the point where it will melt, about 1800 degrees. That is an extremely difficult temperature to achieve through natural means. But you can turn iron into a liquid. You can take the solid and turn it into a liquid. By the application of not that much more heat, you can turn that liquid into a gas. This is indisputable fact. We can do these things. And so this entire speculation is proved false through scientific observation through the lens of history. And it is just another one of those confirmations that it is fine to speculate about things, but you should not assert them as fact. Recent observations justify us in regarding this as a miniature sun with an external envelope of cloudy matter, apparently of partially condensed water, but red hot or probably still hotter within. His vaporous atmosphere is evidently of enormous depth, and the force of gravitation being on his visible outer surface 2.5 times greater than that of our Earth's surface, the atmospheric pressure in descending below this visible surface must soon reach that at which the vapor of water could be brought to its critical condition. Therefore, we may infer that the oceans of Jupiter are neither frozen, liquid, nor gaseous water, but are oceans or atmospheres of critical water. If any fish or birds swim or fly therein, they must be very critically organized. As the whole mass of Jupiter is 300 times greater than that of the Earth, and its compressing energy towards the center proportional to this, its materials, if similar to those of Earth and no hotter, would be considerably more dense, and the whole planet would have a higher specific gravity. But we know by the movement of its satellites that, instead of this, its specific gravity is less than a fourth of that of the Earth. Gaseous planet, anyone? This justifies the conclusion that it is intensely hot, for even hydrogen, if cold, would become denser than Jupiter under such pressure. As all elementary substances may exist as solids, liquids, or gases, or critically, according to the conditions of temperature and pressure, I am justified in hypothetically concluding that Jupiter is neither a solid, a liquid, nor a gaseous planet, but a critical planet, or an orb composed internally of associated elements in the critical state, and surrounded by a dense atmosphere of their vapors, and those of some of their compounds, such as water. The same reasoning applies to Saturn and other large and rarefied planets. It is gratifying to see how scientific imagination approaches every year more closely to the borderland of our occult teachings. Now, it is a gaseous planet. It does have a solid core, And in some ways, you could even explain it as critical, right? If you were to say that water heated to the point of vapor is critical, then yes, it is critical. If you were even to consider that the temperature and pressure would not allow for the change of a state, then yes, it is critical. And so, in part, this is correct, but for the main, it is not. All right, let's see if I can find where that footnote started. Was that footnote 1? Yes. Okay. All the way at the top. All right. It must, however, be always borne in mind that the eternal spring referred to is only a condition cognized as such by the Jovians. It is not spring as we know it. In this reservation is to be found the reconciliation between the two theories here cited. Both embrace partial truth. It is thus a universal tradition that mankind has evolved gradually into its present shape from an almost transparent condition of texture, and neither by miracle nor by sexual intercourse. No. Moreover, this is in full accord with the ancient philosophies, from those of Egypt and India, which you claim are the same, with their divine dynasties, down to that of Plato, who you also says shares the same source material. And all these universal beliefs must be classed with the presentiments and obstinate conceptions, some of them ineradicable in popular faiths. Now, here is something you can do, right, in order to conceptualize this a little bit better. Suppose 500 years from now there had been an apocalyptic situation, and most of humanity was gone, but we retained the ability to read and write English. The survivors, going through a library one day, come across the remnants of these books, and they're able to read the books, and from these books they are introduced to Methodist doctrine, that's the word, doctrine, Methodist, Baptist, Pentecostal, and Catholic, right? And through these 4 different books describing 4 different religions, they come to the conclusion that everybody on the planet must have at some point in time worshipped Jesus Christ. That would be wrong. Not even a majority of the planet has done so. Most of the people on the planet have not held Christianity as their belief. But if this was your evidence, you would believe that there were 4 different religions founded upon the same thing. You wouldn't understand that it was one religion with 4 different branches. It would be 4 different religions with a commonality of a worship point. That is basically what's happening here, right? This, according to her hypotheses, which I lean towards, if the progenitor of this religion was indeed the Aryans, which are Indians, not white people from Europe, if indeed that is the source, then it makes sense that through the dissipation, it may change a little bit, but it would have a commonality. That is what she is witnessing here, right? She spent a whole book arguing that this is the case. And then, when you find evidence in a different culture, which you claim came from the original culture, of similarities, you can't hold that as 2 independent confirmations, right? You are taking one confirmation which was pulled from the other confirmation. And so it is not independent sources. It is, instead, the same source reapplied. That is the problem that she is facing here, and repeatedly. And that's the part that really annoys me, more than anything else about this whole thing, is that she spends so much time arguing the point that it is a common faith, that it is a common source material, and then all of this, well, Egypt and India believed it, so it must be true. They were separated by thousands of miles. But it's the same source material, according to you, with reasons to believe that. It cannot be taken as an independent correlation if it was taken from the other thing. Right? That's like saying, well, I read these 4 books, and so I'm going to say that the Methodist is correct because their procedures align more with what I want. Well, They pulled their procedures from the Catholic Church, right? The Catholic Church is the source material for the other three. The Catholic Church created the religion pretty much wholesale, right? They took all of these traditions and integrated them in themselves, and then people reformed that into the other religions. And so the source material is naturally going to correlate with the revisions, at least in part. Back to the text. Such beliefs, as remarked by Louis Figuier, are frequently the outcome of the wisdom and observation of an infinite number of generations and men. For a tradition which has a uniform and universal existence has all the weight of scientific testimony. That is not true. Footnote: the day after death, page 23. Right now, that is definitely not true. Right? Just because it is written down does not make it true. Period. The end. Straight off the top. It can be true. It can be proven evidentially to be true. And so, through evidence, you can add the weight of scientific testimony, right? We have this thing. We are able to verify this thing through these procedures, which are reproducible by other people. That is not a possibility for any religious belief. Mine, yours, anybody on the planet. Not going to be able to verifiably prove that you are forgiven by the blood of anyone. That is not going to be a thing that you can prove. You can refer to books. That does not prove anything. Right? The proof would be God saying, yes, I accept the sacrifice audibly in front of witnesses now. Right now. Not recorded in the way like, this is my son and I am so happy with him. He ducked his head under the water and therefore he is now accepted as my child. Right? That is something that was written by people creating a religion. You don't have to like that fact, but it is a fact. They were creating a religion. Right? They were separating themselves from Judaism. They were creating a religion. And so the things that they record have to be taken with a grain of salt. They were trying to convince people that this thing is correct. Not through proof, not through evidence, but simply because I said so. That is never going to work, right? And so we will never have a tradition which has a uniform and universal, has all the weight of a scientific testimony. First off, it is not universal. Use source material problem. And if you go across the ocean, some of the things are the same, but not everything. And so, not universal. Back to the text. And there is more than one such tradition in the Puranic allegories, as has been shown. So that is one source, not many, right? There's more than one tradition, fine, from one people, not universal. Moreover, the doctrine that the first race of mankind was formed out of the Kakayas, astral images, of the Pitras, is fully corroborated in the Zohar, which to me carries zero weight. In the Tazalam, shadow image of Elohim, the Pitras, was made Adam, man. Cremona, edition 3, 76a. It has been repeatedly urged as an objection that, however high the degree of metaphysical thought in India, yet the old Egyptians had nothing but crass idolatry and zoolatry to boast of. Hermes, as alleged, being the work of mystic Greeks who lived in Egypt. To this, one answer can be given. A direct proof that the Egyptians believed in the secret doctrine is that it was taught to them at initiation. Let the objectors open the Ecologiae Physicae et Ethicae of Stobaeus, the Greek compiler of ancient fragments, who lived in the 5th century A.D. The following is a transcription by him of an old Hermetic fragment showing the Egyptian theory of the soul. Translated word for word, it says, From one soul, that of all, spring all the souls, which spread themselves as is purposely distributed through the world. These souls undergo many transformations. Those which are already creeping creatures turn into aquatic animals. From these aquatic animals are derived land animals, and from the latter the birds. From the beings who live aloft in the air, heaven, men are born. On reaching that status of men, the souls receive the principle of conscious immortality, become spirits, and then pass into the choirs of gods. Now, this doesn't necessarily say what she is alleging here, right? It says that from one soul, that of all, springs all the souls. To me, that is the divine, right? That is God, not the entities. From the one soul, you are differentiated as a soul, right? I have the Trinity, the body, the soul, and the spirit. From the spirit, the body is knit, but the body is the temple by which you navigate 5D space by making decisions as the individualized piece of divinity that is the soul. And so, from the one soul, all the souls were differentiated, including the ones in dogs and cats and pigs and mice. All of them are created animals. All of them are given a soul, even if it is not the same soul that we have. It is differentiated for them in the same way that it is for us. And so, to me, this doesn't mean anything at all about the entities. It does not reinforce the secret doctrine at all, right? Not what she is saying, that there was this spiritual being that became a mist being, who then became a water being, who then gave birth to people, right? That is not what this is saying at all. Many transformations, that again leads towards my theory of spiritual evolution, where you go from the individualized atom all the way up into the entities. Now, how that progression happens, that's beyond me. And I don't really know whether there is some karmic debt that would bring you back down the chain. I don't believe so, but it is possible. I do believe that there is a progression. How exactly that progression works, I don't know. Was I a dog in a last life and I'm a human now? I don't know. Was the human soul always human? I don't know. That is one of the things we can speculate upon, but we cannot say as fact. This is stating as fact that the fish become birds, and then birds become animals, and then animals become people, and I don't believe that. Right? Or the other way. Fish, animals, birds. I don't believe that. 23. The self-born were the Cacaias, the shadows from the bodies of the sons of twilight. Neither water nor fire could destroy them. Their sons were so destroyed. A. This verse cannot be understood without the help of the commentaries. It means that the first root race, the shadows of the progenitors, could not be injured. That's not what it says. Or destroyed by death. Now, you can believe that, but that is not what it says. It says that the self-born were the Cacaias. We could be self-born, right? If we are created, that is self-born, right? Now, I believe that we are created beings. I believe that we are ensouled, that we are here intentionally for reasons, not as a punishment. And so that choosing to come and be incarnated can be self-born. It does not necessarily mean that there is some other entity that we are not associated with. It can, but it doesn't necessarily have to be. The shadows from the bodies of the son of twilight, that's a little bit ambiguous, right? Neither water nor fire could destroy them does not mean that earth could not. It does not mean immortality, right? It can. You can say that, but it doesn't necessarily mean that. That is an important distinction. Being so ethereal, and so little human in constitution, they could not be affected by any element, flood or fire. Even if, no matter what you are, the fire, right, the fire of the Holy Spirit is going to be able to destroy you one way or the other. But their sons, the second root race, could be, and were so, destroyed. As the progenitors merged wholly in their own astral bodies, which were their progeny, so that progeny was absorbed in its descendants, the sweat-born. These were the second humanity, composed of the most heterogeneous, gigantic, semi-human monsters. The first attempts of material nature at building human bodies. The ever-blooming lands of the second continent, Greenland among others, were transformed in order from Edens with their eternal spring into Hyperborean Hades. The transformation was due to the displacement of the great waters of the globe to oceans changing their beds, and the bulk of the second race perished in this first great throe of the evolution and consolidation of the globe during the human period. Of such great cataclysms there have already been 4. Footnote. We will talk about that. The first occurred when what is now the North Pole was separated from the later continents. I believe some wild things. One of those wild things is the 12,000 year disaster cycle. It gets linked a lot, right? I'm going to remember, hopefully, to put the 12,000 year disaster cycle again today, because it is an explanation for this. Now, this number 4, I don't know where she's getting that from. It is possible, it is entirely possible that there were more than that. Now, Timaeus, I believe, does not put a specific number upon, but says something along the lines that the last 1 or 2 are just merely the most recent and the ones you remember, right? Something along those lines. It's been a while. But in Timaeus, we have plenty of reason to believe that this 12,000 year disaster cycle does happen. What she is talking about here is explained by that. Now, there could be, at some point in Earth's history, that we existed under what is called the vapor canopy, which is there was no water upon the face of the Earth, but instead it was a extremely humid area, and we got our water from the air and from eating plants. With that in mind, after the change of the flood, there was different, right? It is, then we got water coming from the sky, and then we had rivers and lakes and oceans that were. Those things are not in Genesis. As in, they are not existent in the beginning of Genesis. The rivers, the lakes, and the oceans and things, as it is explained, before the flood, they weren't. And then after the flood, they were. And so that explains, in part, for the let's eat animals now. That explains, in part, for many of the things in Genesis. And so there are reasons to believe that there is a cataclysmic cycle that happens. The exact details of that, despite the scientific evidence, are still inconclusive. It is possible that there were only 4 of these cycles, and it is possible that there have been 24 of these cycles. Right? We do not know the exact number, nor even the exact mechanic by which it happens. But there are very good reasons to believe that it does happen, which are outlined here. That would explain this, though, right? The ever-blooming lands becoming something else, that is explained by the 12,000 year disaster cycle. The finding of a mammoth in Antarctica, or in the Arctic Circle, with food in its stomach that has not been digested yet, that is explained by the 12,000 year disaster cycle. Much better than we are getting here. Back to the text. And we may expect a fifth for ourselves in the due course of time. That I also agree with. We talk about that in the 12,000 year disaster cycle. We are imminent to it. The last one being 6,000 years ago, and that being the half cycle, right? There is a repeating pattern every 12,000 years. But in the interlude, in the very middle of that, there is an opposite pattern, right? There is a fire event that reshapes the earth. Then there is a water event 6,000 years later. And then 6,000 years following that, there is another fire event. We are imminent upon the fire event. I don't believe it's going to be tomorrow, but it will probably be within my natural course of my life, right? I've got about 40, 50 years left. It will probably be in the middle of that. Now, I could die tomorrow. Obviously, I am not the determining factor. But 20 years is a good estimate. 40 years is actually pushing the limits of what we believe will happen. 40 years is on the outside. 20 years is probably right around that sweet spot. It might be a decade, but it's probably closer to 20 years. For many reasons, which again are outlined in the 12,000 year disaster cycle. A few words about deluges and Noahs. The accounts in the various Puranas about our progenitors are as contradictory in their details as everything else. Thus, while in the Rig Veda, Ida, or Illa, is called the instructress of Vayavasvata Manu, Sayana makes of her a goddess presiding over the earth. And the Sathapatha Brahmana shows her to be Manu's daughter, an offering of his sacrifice, and later on, his Vayavasvata's wife, by whom he begat the race of Manus. That is easily explained, right? You want to know what happened? People. People have this incessant need to change the story to fit what they believe a little bit better, right? That is evidenced by the Baptist, the Methodist, the Protestant, like the Protestant movement in general. That is what happened here, right? Somebody read the Rig Vedas and then they're like, well, that's cool, but I think it means this. And so they created what is the Sayana. And then people were reading that and they're like, well, that's cool, but I think it went like this. And so they created the Sathapatha Brahmana. I cannot say definitively that that is the process by which it happened, but it makes sense and it is entirely possible. In the Puranas, again, she is Vayavasvata's daughter, yet the wife of Buddha, wisdom, the illegitimate son of the moon, Soma, and the planet Jupiter's, Brihaspati's wife, Terra. All this, which seems a jumble to the profane, is full of philosophical meaning to the occultist. On the very face of the narrative, a secret and sacred meaning is perceivable. All the details, however, being so purposely mixed up that the experienced eye of an initiate alone can follow them and place the events in their proper order. As told in the Mahabharata, strikes the keynote. The story, as told, strikes the keynote, and yet it needs to be explained by the secret sense contained in the Bhagavad Gita. It is the prologue to the drama of our fifth humanity. While Vayavasvata was engaged in devotion on the river bank, a fish craves his protection from a bigger fish. He saves and places it in a jar where, growing larger and larger, it communicates to him the news of the forthcoming deluge. It is the well-known Matsya avatar, the first avatar of Vishnu, the Dagon. Footnote. We must remember that at the head of all the Babylonian gods were Yah, Anu, and the primeval Bel, and that Yah, the first, was the god of wisdom, the great god of light and of the deep, and that he was identified with Oannes, or the biblical Dagon, the man-fish who rose out of the Persian Gulf. The first avatar of Vishnu, the Dagon of the Chaldean Zisthros, and many of the other things besides. The story is too well known to need repetition. Vishnu orders a ship to be built in which Manu is said to be saved along with the 7 rishis, the latter, however, being absent from the other texts. Here, the 7 rishis stand for the 7 races, the 7 principles, and various other things. For there is again a double mystery involved in this manifold allegory. We have said elsewhere that the Great Flood had several meanings, and that it referred, and also does, to the fall, to both spiritual and physical, cosmic and terrestrial events. As above, so it is below. The ship, or ark, navis, in short, being the symbol of the female generative principle, is typified in the heavens by the moon, and on earth by the womb, both being the vessels and bearers of the seed of life, and being, which the sun, or Vishnu, the male principle, vivifies and fructifies. Footnote 2. See Part 2, the Holy of Holies. The first cosmic flood refers to primordial creation, or the formation of heaven and the earths, in which case chaos and the great deep stand for the flood, and the moon for the mother, from whom proceed all the life germs. Footnote 3. It is far later on that the moon became a male god. With the Hindus, it was Soma. With the Chaldeans, Nanak or Nanar, and Sin, the son of Mulil, the older Bel. The Akkadians called him the Lord of Ghosts, and he was the god of Nippur, Niffer, in northern Babylonia. It is Mulil who caused the waters of the flood to fall from heaven to earth, for which Xisthus would not allow him to approach his altar. As the modern Assyriologists have now ascertained, it is the northern Nippur which is the center whence Chaldean, black, magic spread, and Eridu, the southern, which was the primitive seat of the worship of the culture god, the god of divine wisdom, the sun god being the supreme deity everywhere. With the Jews, the moon is connected with Israel's Jehovah and his seed, because was the chief seat of worship of the moon god, and because Abraham is said to have come from when from Abram comes Abraham. But the terrestrial deluge and its story has also its dual application. In one case, it has reference to that mystery when mankind was saved from utter destruction by the mortal woman being made receptacle of the human seed at the end of the 3rd race. Footnote. When Narada, the virgin ascetic, threatened to put an end to the human race by preventing Daksha's sons from procreating it. And, in the other, to the real and historical Atlantean submersion. In both cases, the host, or the Manu which saved the seed, is called Vaivasvata Manu. Hence the diversity between the Puranic and other versions. While in the Sathapatha Brahmana, Vaivasvata produces a daughter and begets from her the race of Manu, which is a reference to the first human Manushas, who had to create women by will, Kriya Sakti, before they were naturally born from the hermaphrodites as an independent sex, and who were, therefore, regarded as their creator's daughters. The Puranic accounts make of her Ida, or Ila, the wife of Buddha, wisdom, the latter version referring to the events of the Atlantean flood, when Vaivasvata, the great sage on earth, saved the 5th root race from being destroyed along with the remnants of the 4th. This is very clearly shown in the Bhagavad Gita, where Krishna is made to say, "The 7 great rishis, the 4 preceding Manus, partaking of my essence, were born from my mind. From them were born, the human races and the world." That does not say anything about the saving from the flood. Here, the 4 preceding Manus out of the 7 are the 4 races. Footnote 2. This is corroborated by a learned Brahmin. In his most excellent lectures on the Bhagavad Gita, the lecturer says, "There is a peculiarity to which I must call your attention. He, Krishna, speaks here of 4 Manus. Why does he speak of 4? We are now in the 7th Manvantara, that of Vayavasavata. He is speaking of the past Manus. He ought to speak of 6, but he only mentions 4. I wonder why. In some commentaries, an attempt has been made to interpret this in a peculiar manner. The word Katavaraha is separated from the word Manavaha. It is made to refer to Sanaka, Sandanana, Sanat Kumara, and Sanat Sujata, who are also included among the mind-born sons of Prajapati. But this interpretation will lead to a most absurd conclusion and make the sentence contradict itself. The persons alluded to in the text have a qualifying clause in the sentence. It is well known that Sanaka and the other 3 refused to create, though the other sons had consented to do so. Therefore, in speaking of those persons from whom humanity has sprung into existence, it would be absurd to include these 4 also in the list. The passage must be interpreted without splitting the compound into 2 nouns. The number of Manus will then be 4, and the statement would then contradict the Puranic account. Although it would be in harmony with the occult theory, you will recollect that it stated, in occultism, that we are now in the 5th root race. Each root race is considered as the Sunathahi of a particular Manu. Now, the 4th race is past, or, in other words, there have been 4 past Manus. Out of the 7 are the 4 races which have already lived. Since Krishna belongs to the 5th race, his death having inaugurated the Kali Yuga. Thus, Vayavasavata, Manu, the son of Surya, the sun, and the savior of our race, is connected with the seed of life, both physically and spiritually. But, at present, while speaking of all, we have to concern ourselves only with the first 2. The deluge is undeniably a universal tradition. Glacial periods were numerous, and so were the deluges for various reasons. Stockwell and Kroll enumerate some half-dozen glacial periods and subsequent deluges, see the 12,000-year disaster cycle, the earliest of all being dated by them 850,000, and the last about 100,000 years ago. We now have greater knowledge. Footnote 1. Smithsonian Contributions to Knowledge. American Journal of Science, and Kroll's Climate and Time. Lemuria was not submerged by a flood, but was destroyed by volcanic action, and afterwards sank. I am unaware of primary material for Lemuria. If you know of the primary material for Lemuria, let me know. I am eventually going to look that up, but at this point I am unaware where we get that from. I believe that was concurrent to Atlantis, and I don't have anything to contradict that, so I need more evidentiary support. So if you know let me know. But which was our deluge? The one 6,000 years ago. Assuredly the former, the one which to this date remains recorded in the traditions of all the peoples, from the remotest antiquity, the one that finally swept away the last peninsulas of Atlantis, beginning with Ruta and Aita, and ending with the comparatively small island mentioned by Plato. And here again we have her being deliberately misleading. Right? We have gone through Timaeus. Timaeus does not at any point in time intimate that there was a small island called Atlantis. What is instead directly stated in the text is that once upon a time this continent was the size of Saharan Africa. They say it was the size of Egypt combined with Libya. Now, that is not our current borders, but instead the borders of antiquity, which was every bit of Saharan Africa. from the mountains that divide the Sahara from the sub-Sahara, every single bit of that land was roughly the same size as Atlantis. It was a continent, not a small island. And in the text of Timaeus, it tells us that there were 10 separate kingdoms which comprised Atlantis, of all roughly equal size. We are given dimensions for the kingdom of Atlantis. That is an important distinction, and it is one that is contained directly in the text. Right? That is not me making an extrapolation. That is what is stated. It is not on the other side of Peru, right, in the Pacific Ocean, which some people believe. I believe that was the Lemuria. And that, yes, there was concurrent between Lemuria and Atlantis for reasons that I don't have full support for yet, right? This is my intuition leading this part. That the people who believe that Atlantis were Easter Island and westward, that was Lemuria, and it was concurrent, right? These two places existed probably at the same time and may have even had trade between each other. The continents in the current configuration were not there, right? I believe that the 12,000-year disaster cycle causes parts of the earth to raise up and go down for various reasons, and so this is directly in opposition to what is directly stated in the source material that she is quoting. Right? This isn't even a misunderstanding. This is a direct misrepresentation of what is recorded in the record. That has to be abundantly clear. Directly contradicting what is written to make it fit with what you want. That is a problem every time. Back to the text. This is shown by the agreement of certain details in all the legends. It was the last of its gigantic character, the little deluge, which traces of which Baron Bunsen found in Central Asia, and which he places at about 10,000 years BC, which would be roughly 12,000 years ago from now, had nothing to do with either the semi-universal deluge or Noah's flood, the latter being a purely mythical rendering of old traditions, nor even with the submersion of the last Atlantean island, at least only a moral connection. And that is not recorded, right? The 12,000 years ago, that is an extrapolation based upon scientific knowledge. The only recording of a deluge from which we have any evidentiary records are all dated about the same time, 6,000 years ago, not 12. That 12,000 years ago, to me, that is going to be the hot event, not the wet event. For reasons, again, the 12,000-year disaster cycle. And so this is somebody inserting something that does not necessarily belong there once again. Back to the text. Our fifth race, the non-initiated portions, hearing of many deluges, confuse them, and now know of but one. This one altered the whole aspect of the globe and its interchange and shifting of land and sea. All of them did. Again, outlined in the 12,000-year disaster cycle. I'm not trying to repeat the entirety of that lesson because it's a long one. We may compare the traditions of the Peruvians. The Incas, 7 in number, have repeopled the earth after the deluge, they say, which would be an entirely distinct repeopling from what happened in India. Right? Understand that fully and completely too. If these stories are correct, if there were deluges, everybody records themselves as having been the people to survive it. The Incas not being accepted from that. Now, the Hopi, in particular, were told that they were guided into the earth where they survived the flood and then were led back out of the earth. Right? That is their belief about this flood. The Incas had their beliefs. The Sumerians had theirs. The Akkadians had their own. The Hindus had their own. Everybody has one. And according to them, they are the people who survived. every time. Imagine that. And so, to say that there was only a survivor is foolish at best, malicious at worst. The people who are trying to portray themselves as God's chosen people chose to say that they were the only ones to survive, but the other ones don't say that. They say that they survived, but they don't say that everybody else died. That is another big distinction. All right, back to the text. Humboldt mentions the Mexican version of the same legend, but confuses somewhat the details of the still preserved legend concerning the American Noah. Nevertheless, the eminent naturalist mentions twice 7 companions and the divine bird, which preceded the boat of the Aztecs, and thus makes 15 elect instead of the 7 and 14. This was written probably under some involuntary reminiscence of Moses, who is said to have mentioned 15 grandsons of Noah, who escaped with their grandsire. Where? Where is that evidenced at? We don't have a footnote for that. Then again, Zisustrus, the Chaldean Noah, is saved and translated alive to heaven, like Enoch, with the 7 gods, the Kabirim, or the 7 divine titans. Again, the Chinese Yao has 7 figures which sail with him and which he will animate when he lands and use for human seed. Osiris, when he enters the ark, or solar boat, takes 7 rays with him, etc., etc. Sanchoniathon makes the Aletae, or Titans, the Kabirim, contemporary with Agrarius, the great Phoenician god, whom Faber sought to identify with Noah. Footnote 1. Agurius is Kronos, or Saturn, and the prototype of the Israelitish Jehovah, as connected with Arga, the moon, or Ark of Salvation. Noah is mythologically one with Saturn. But then, this cannot relate to the terrestrial flood. Let's see Faber's Kabiri. Further, it is suspected that the name Titan is derived from Tit-Ein, the fountains of the chaotic abyss. Footnote 2. See Ibid, Volume 2. Tit-Teus, or Titius, is the divine deluge, and thus the Titans, who are 7, are shown to be connected with the flood and the 7 rishis saved by Vaivasvata Manu. Footnote 3. Sanchoniathon says that the Titans were the sons of Kronos and 7 in number, and he calls them fire worshippers. Alatai, sons of Agni, and Diluvians. Alite is the god of fire. They are the sons of Kronos, time, and Rhea, the earth, and as Agrurus, Saturn and Sidic are one and the same personage, and as the 7 Kabiri are said to be the sons of Sidic, or Kronos Saturn, the Kabiri and Titans are identical. For once the pious Faber was right in his conclusions when he wrote, "I have no doubt of the 7 Titans and Kabiri being the same as the 7 rishis of the Hindu mythology, who was said to have escaped in a boat along with Manu, the head of the family." But he is less fortunate in his speculations when he adds, "The Hindus, in their wild legends, have variously perverted the history of the Noachide. Yet it is remarkable that they seem to have religiously adhered to the number 7. Footnote 4. Of the 7, let us remark, the Aryans and not the Semites were the originators, while the Jews got that number from the Chaldeans. That has been repeatedly the argument, so we're not going to hit it. Hence, Captain Colonel Wilford very judiciously observes that perhaps the 7 Manus, the 7 Brahmanikas, and the 7 Rishis are the same, and make only 7 individual persons. Footnote 5. 7 individual sons of God, or Petars and Pitras. Also in this case, the sons of Kronos or Saturn, Kala, time, and Archites, like the Kabiri Titans, as their name, lunar ancestors, show the moon being the arc, or Arga, on the watery abyss of space. That is definitely one of the theories. Now, I believe that these 7 are because of your internal chakras, right? The formation of you is directly from these 7 internal chakras into the 1 external. The 7 Brahmatikas were Prajapati, or lords of the Prajas, or creatures. From them, mankind was born, and they are probably the same with the 7 Manus. These 7 grand ancestors of the human race were created for the purpose of replenishing the earth with inhabitants. Asiatic Researches, Volume 5. And Faber adds that the mutual resemblance of the Kabias, the Titans, and the Rishis, and the Noetic family is too striking to be the effect of mere accident. It is important to note that the Noah account was taken almost entirely from the Sumerian account. Footnote 6. See Kabiri, Volume 1. Faber was led into this mistake and subsequently built his entire theory concerning the Kabiri on the fact that the name of the scriptural Japhet is on the list of Titans contained in a verse of the Orphic hymns. According to Orpheus, the names of the 7 Archite Titans, whom Faber refuses to identify with the impious Titans, their descendants, were Coeus, Croeus, Phorikis, Kronos, Oceanus, Hyperion, and Iapetus. I'm not reading the Greek on that one. But why could not the Babylonian Ezra have adopted the name of Oedipus for one of the Noah's sons? The Kabiri, who are the Titans, are also called Manes, and their mother Mania, according to Arnobius. The Hindus can therefore claim with far more reason than the Manes mean their Manus, and that Mania is the female Manu. See Ramayana. Mania is Ila, or Ida, the wife and daughter of Vivasvata Manu, from whom he begat the race of Manus. Like Rhea, the mother of the Titans, she is the earth, Sanyana making her the goddess of the earth, and she is but the second edition and repetition of Vak. Both Ida and Vak are turned into males and females, Ida becoming Sudyoma, and Vak the female Varash, turning into a woman in order to punish the Gandharvas. One version referring to cosmic and divine theogony, the other to the later period. The Manes and Mania of Arnobius are names of Indian origin, appropriated by the Greeks and Latins, and disfigured by them. Thus, it is no accident, but the result of one archaic doctrine common to all, of which the Israelites, through Ezra, the author of the modernized Mosaic books, were the latest adapters. So unceremonious were they with other people's property that Berosus, Antiquities Libya, shows that Titia, of whom Diodorus makes the mother of the Titans or Diluvians, was the wife of Noah. For this, Faber calls him the Pseudo-Berosus, yet accepts the information in order to register one more proof that the pagans have borrowed all their gods from the Jews by transforming patriarchal material. According to our humble opinion, this is one of the best proofs possible of exactly the reverse. It shows as clearly as facts can show that it is the biblical pseudo-personages which are all borrowed from pagan myths, if myths they must be. It shows at any rate that Berosus was well aware of the source of Genesis, and that it bore the same cosmic astronomical character as the allegories of Isis, Osiris, and the Ark, and other older archite symbols. For Berosus says that Titia Magna was afterwards called Aricia. Footnote 1. Aricia is the female form of Artes, Egyptian Mars. Thence the Chaldean and now Hebrew word Arest, earth. The author of Betraj zur Kintes quotes, Adit Cedrinus Stella Martis ab Egyptus vocator torsoi planetary genere. Now let's skip. It is the earth as source of being, or as explained by the author of The Source of Measures. Arts is the same in Hebrew and Egyptian, and both combine the primeval idea of earth as source, precisely as in the Hebrew itself under another form. Adam and Medium, Mars, are the same, and combine the idea of earth with Adam under the form of Adam Ha. Alright. Was afterwards called Aricia and worshipped with the earth, and this identifies Tatia, Noah's consort, with Rhea, the mother of the Titans, and with Ida, both being goddesses who preside over the earth, and the mothers of the Manus and Manes, or Tit and Kabiri. And Titia Aricia was worshipped as Horkia, and says the same Borosius. And this is the title of Vesta, goddess of the earth. Scarce an ancient poet of historic or prehistoric days who failed to mention the seeking of the two continents, often called isles, in one form or another. Hence the destruction, besides Atlantis, of the Phalagi, see Pausanias and Nonus, who both tell how. From its deep-rooted base, the Phlegian isle, stern Neptune shook and plunged beneath the waves. Its impious inhabitants. Faber felt convinced that the Insulae Phalagi were Atlantis, but all such allegories are more or less distorted echoes of the Hindu tradition about that great cataclysm, which befell the fourth, really human, though gigantic, race, the one which preceded the Aryan. Yet, as just said, like all the other legends, that of the deluge has more than one meaning. It refers in theogony to pre-cosmic transformations, to spiritual correlations. However absurd the term may sound to the scientific ear, and also to subsequent cosmogony, to the great flood of waters, matter, in chaos, awakened and fructified by those spirit rays which was swamped by and perished in the mysterious differentiation, a pre-cosmic mystery, the prologue to the drama of being. Anu, Bel, and Noah preceded Adam Kadmon, Adam the Red, and Noah, just as Brahma, Vishnu, and Siva preceded Vayavasvata and the rest. See Isis Unveiled Volume 2, which we have done in its entirety, where one or two of the seven meanings are hinted at. All this goes to show that the semi-universal deluge known to geology, first glacial period, must have occurred just at the time allotted to it by the secret doctrine. It does not show that. Namely, 200,000 years, in round numbers, after the commencement of our fifth race, or about the time assigned by Messrs. Kroll and Stockwell for the first glacial period. An example, about 850,000 years ago. It does not show that. Thus, as the latter disturbance is attributed by geologists and astronomers to an extreme eccentricity of the Earth's orbit, that is probably true. I mean, if indeed the Earth was glaciated, there is this thing called the Younger Dryas period, upon which there was a rapid deglaciation that most likely occurred. The only way that that happened is due to an introduction of thermals, right? There has to have been a thermal event in order to create the conditions which would lead to the rapid deglaciation of the planet. That is most likely explained by the sun exploding, for lack of a better term, right? There is a cosmic explosion that happens. It happens like there is one pretty much not quite every day, but pretty close to every day in the solar maximum at least. Coronal mass ejections, various flares, and things along that nature. If we had a flare directed directly towards the planet, that would be an introduction of thermal energy in a way that would support rapid deglaciation. That is something that is not only possible, but probable and even likely. Part of the 12,000 year disaster cycle takes that into account, and many of the other theories don't even necessarily have to be true, right? The turning of the 90 degrees, I believe that that is true for a variety of reasons, but it doesn't necessarily have to be as long as we have this introduction of this energy. That does not mean that there has to be an extreme eccentricity of the Earth. But if there were, indeed, as I talk about in the 12,000 year disaster cycle, the planet eccentrically changing its orbit, that would account for it as well. If the North and the South Pole, in its current state of glaciation, were introduced to the area of the equator, that would be an introduction of thermals to the extent that it would deglaciate. And so either one of those two theories are equally plausible. It is probable that there was a conjunction of the two that led to the deglaciation. So what she is talking about here, right, the latter disturbance, unexplained, but probably what I just said. And so it doesn't have to necessarily attach to either one of those, but it is probably due to the shifting of the Earth's axis. And as the secret doctrine attributes it to the same source, but with the addition of another factor, the shifting of the Earth's axis, see the 12,000 year disaster cycle, a proof of which may be found in the Book of Enoch. Footnote. Now, we read the Book of Enoch, and I do not know that that is contained in there. Again, ancient lore. I don't know if that's in there or not. I don't even remember. Like, Enoch seemed to be mostly a just fabrication out of wholesale cloth, which may be found in the Book of Enoch if the veiled language of the Puranas is not understood. All this should tend to show that the ancients knew something of the modern discoveries of science. Enoch, when speaking of the great inclination of the earth, which is in travail, is quite significant and clear. Now, it is entirely possible if this shifting of the Earth's axis does actually happen, some people are going to survive it. Most people are not, right? Again, fall back to the disaster cycle. Most of the population of the Earth will disappear, but people will survive. And the ones who will survive are going to make a record of it, right? Even if you are unable, you don't have a written language, you're going to draw pictures. You will create a verbal history. This thing happened. We were outside one day and the Earth, like all of the stars in the sky, started shaking. Everything looked different. There was something different happening. It will be recorded in the oral histories. That can be anthropomorphized into the gods made it happen, or a variety of other things, but it will be recorded. This was a recording, possibly, of that. Right? If there were people who survived the turning of the planet, they would record that. And so it is possible that this is a recording of that. The same for all of the flood stories, right? If everybody did actually survive, even if it was this one guy going around telling everybody to get ready, right? If there was an angel or an entity that appeared and said, hey, there's a flood coming, build a boat. Right? Or, hey, there's a flood coming, let's hide you in these caves deep underneath the ground. These things are possible and would be recorded, and were. Is not this evident? Noah is Noah, floating on the waters in his ark, the latter being the emblem of Arga, the moon, the female principle. Noah is the spirit falling into matter. We find him, as soon as he descends upon the earth, planting a vineyard, drinking of the wine, and getting drunk. That is a little bit later than as soon as. As soon as is when he got told that we can eat meat now. That's what happened as soon as, right? The first thing he did was build an altar, give thanks for the delivery, and then God came down and said, I make this covenant with you. That covenant is the one that I hold to, right? Go forth, subdue the earth, be stewards therein. Go forth, be stewards of the earth, subdue the earth, be stewards therein, and shed no blood of man. That's the end of it, right? And, by the way, now you can eat meat, right? That was what was told to them. This planting the vineyard, drinking of the wine, and getting drunk on it, that was later. In example, the pure spirit becomes intoxicated as soon as it is finally imprisoned in matter. And again, it was not as soon as. It was not even his first action. The 7th chapter of Genesis is only another version of the first. Thus, while the latter reads, And darkness was upon the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters. In chapter 7 it is said, And the waters prevailed, and the ark went, with Noah the Spirit, upon the face of the waters. That is not the same. Thus, Noah, if identical with the Chaldean Nuah, is the spirit vivifying matter, which latter is chaos, represented by the deep, or the waters of the flood. In the Babylonian legend, the pre-cosmical blended with the terrestrial event, it is Ishtar, Ashtaroth or Venus, the lunar goddess, who is shut up in the ark and sends out a dove in search of dry land. Isis unveiled. It is important to note that in the Sumerian legend, Utnapishtim is the figure of Noah. His sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, are on the boat with him, and that is almost exactly copied into the story of Noah in Genesis, right? It is the Sumerian account, which is almost identical with the story from Genesis and predates every single instance of it in Genesis by a millennium. George Smith notes in the tablets, first the creation of the moon, and then that of the sun. Its beauty and perfection are extolled, and the regularity of its orbit, which led to its being considered the type of judge and regulator of the world. If this story related to a cosmogonical cataclysm, even were this latter universal, why should the goddess Ishtar, or Ashtoreth, the moon, speak of the creation of the sun after the deluge? See the Thunderbolts Project for more information on that. There is many reasons to believe that the polar configuration of the sun was not what it is now. The waters might have reached as high as the mountain of Nazir, Chaldean version, or Jebel Juji, the deluge mountains of the Arabian legend, or yet Ararat of the biblical narrative, and even the Himalaya of the Hindu tradition, and yet not reach the sun. The Bible itself stopped short of such a miracle. It is evident that the deluge of the people who first recorded it had another meaning, less problematical and far more philosophical than that of a universal deluge, of which there are no geological traces whatsoever, and that is patently untrue. The Grand Canyon in the United States of America is a proof that this probably happened. Right? The rapid deglaciation, that is very well confirmed. The flood resulting from that, also very well confirmed. More than likely led to the development of the Grand Canyon. The geological wear of that canyon is not accounted for by the current flow of water in it by a large degree. Mr. Randall Carlson can give you better explanations on that. He has spent an extensive amount of time researching that and has several proofs which are definitely lending towards evidentiary that it happened. So what she is stating here is simply not true, right? It is evident that the deluge of the people who first recorded it had another meaning is not true. Less problematical and far more philosophical is what you are reading into it of a universal deluge. There is, indeed, geological traces, maybe not conclusive, but definitely leading in that direction, that a universal deluge did indeed happen. All such cataclysms are periodical and cyclical, and as Manu Vava-Savata figures as a generic character under various circumstances and events, vide infra, the seven Manus of humanity, there seems to be no serious objection to the supposition that the first great flood had an allegorical as well as a cosmic meaning, and that it happened at the end of the Satya Yuga, the Age of Truth, when the second root race, the Manu with bones, made its primeval appearance as the Sweatborn. Footnote. All such expressions are explained in the anthropogenesis of this book and elsewhere. The second flood, the so-called universal, which affected the fourth root race, now conveniently regarded by theology as the accursed race of giants, the Cainites, and the sons of Ham, is that flood which was first perceived by geology. If one carefully compares the account in the various legends of the Chaldees and other exoteric works of the nations, it will be found that all of them agree with the orthodox narratives given in the Brahmanical books. And it may be perceived that while in the first account there is no god or mortal yet on earth, when Manu Vava-Savata lands on the Himavan, in the second, the seven rishis are allowed to keep him company, thus showing that whereas some accounts refer to the sidereal and cosmic flood before the so-called creation, the others treat one of the great flood of matter on earth and the other of a real watery deluge. In the Satapatha Brahmana, Manu finds that the flood had swept away all living creatures and he alone was left. In example, the seed of life alone remained from the previous dissolution of the universe, or Mahapralaya, after a Daya Brahma, and the Mahabharata refers simply to the geological cataclysm which swept away nearly all the fourth race to make room for the fifth. Therefore is Vaiva-Savata Manu shown under three distinct attributes in our esoteric cosmogony. Footnote 2. One has to remember that in the Hindu philosophy, every differentiated unit is such only through the cycles of Maya, being one in its essence with the Supreme or One Spirit. Hence arises the seeming confusion and contradiction in the various Puranas, and at times in the same Purana, about the same individual. Vishnu, as the many-formed Brahma, and as Brahma, neuter, is one, and yet he is said to be all the 28 Vyasas, Vishnu Purana. In every Dvapara, third age, Vishnu, in the person of Vyasa, divides the Veda, which is one, into 4 and many portions. 28 times have the Vedas been arranged by the great rishis in the Vaivasvata Manvantara, in the Dvapara Yuga, and consequently 28 Vyasas have passed away. They who were all in the form of Veda Vyasas, who were the Vyasas of their respective eras. This world is Brahma, in Brahma, from Brahma, nothing further to be known. Then again, there were in the first Manvantara 7 celebrated sons of Vasishta, who in the third Manvantara were the sons of Brahma, i.e. rishis, the illustrious progeny of Urja. This is plain. The humanity of the first Manvantara is that of the seventh, and of all the intermediate ones, the mankind of the first root race is the mankind of the second, third, fourth, fifth, etc. To the last, it forms a cyclic and constant reincarnation of the monads belonging to the Dayan Kohans of our planetary chain. A. As the Root Manu on Globe A in the first round. B. As the Seed of Life on Globe D in the fourth round. And C. As the Seed of Man at the beginning of every root race, in our fifth race especially. The very commencement of the latter witnesses during the Dvapara Yuga. Footnote. The Dvapara Yuga differs for each race. All races have their own cycles, which fact causes a great difference. For instance, the fourth subrace of the Atlanteans was in its Kali Yuga when destroyed, whereas the fifth was in its Satya or Krita Yuga. The Aryan race is now in its Kali Yuga and will continue to be in it for 427,000 years longer. While various family races, called the Semitic, Hamitic, etc., are in their own special cycles. The forthcoming sixth subrace, which may begin very soon, will be in its Satya, Golden Age, while we reap the fruit of our iniquity in our Kali Yuga. It is important to note that if this particular theory is correct, then all of the rest of this study is absolutely useless. It has been stated time and time again that there are periods of action and periods of rest, and that in the periods of action, action occurs, but that in the periods of rest, there is absolutely no action. Those periods of no action follow the Kali Yuga, and if there is indeed a Kali Yuga for every successive one, then there is no period of race or rest. There is just simply not time for it. It's not going to happen. You're immediately going into the first because existence does not rest, according to what you just stated. That is directly contradictory to other things that you have taught in this teaching. Back to the text. During the Dvapara Yuga, the destruction of the accursed sorcerers of that island, Plato speaking only of its last island, beyond the Pillar of Hercules in the Atlantic Ocean, from which there was an easy transition to other islands in the neighborhood of another large continent, America. It is this Atlantic land which was connected with the White Island, and this White Island was Ruta, but it was not the Atala and the White Devil of Colonel Wilford. See Asiatic Researches, as already shown. It may well be remarked here that the Dvapara Yuga lasts 864,000 years, according to the Sanskrit text, and that, if the Kali Yuga began only about 5,000 years ago, that it is just 869,000 since that destruction took place. Again, these figures are not very widely different from those given by the geologists who placed their glacial period 850,000 years ago. They place one of the glacial periods 850,000 years ago. Then, a woman was produced who came to Manu and declared herself his daughter, with whom he lived and begat the offspring of Manu. This refers to the physiological transformation of sexes during the third root race. And the allegory is too transparently clear to need much explanation. Of course, as already remarked in the separation of sexes on androgyne being was supposed to divide his body into two halves, as in the case of Brahma and Vak, and even of Adam and Eve, and thus the female is, in a certain sense, his daughter, just as he will be her son. The flesh of his and her flesh, and the bone of his and her bone. Let it be also well remembered that not one of our Orientalists have yet learned to discern in those contradictions and amazing nonsense, as some call the Puranas, that a reference to a yuga may mean a round, a root race, and often a subrace, as well as form a page torn out of pre-cosmic theogony. The double and triple meaning is proved by various references to one and the same individual apparently under an identical name, while it refers, in fact, to events divided by entire kalpas. A good instance of that is Hela. She is first represented as one thing and then as another. In the exoteric legends, it is said that Manu Vaivasvata, desiring to create sons, instituted a sacrifice to Mitra and Varuna, but through a mistake of the officiating Brahmin, a daughter only was obtained, Hela. Then, through the favor of the gods, her sex is changed and she becomes a man, Sudayumna. Then she is again turned into a woman, and so on. The fable adding that Siva and his consort were pleased that she would be male one month and female another. This has direct reference to the third root race, whose men were androgynes. But some very learned Orientalists think, see Hindu Classical Dictionary, and have declared that Hela was primarily food, nourishment, or a libation of milk, thence a stream of praise, personified as the goddess of speech. The profane are not told, however, the reason why a libation of milk, or a stream of praise, should be male and female by turn, unless, indeed, there is some internal evidence which the occultists fail to perceive. In their most mystical meanings, the union of Swayambhuva Manu with Vaksatarupa, his own daughter, this being the first ehumerization of the dual principle of which Vaivasvata Manu and Hela are a secondary and a third form, stands in cosmic symbolism as the root life, the germ from which spring all the solar systems, the worlds, angels, and the gods. For as says Vishnu, from Manu all creations, God, asuras, man must be produced. By him the world must be created, that which moves and moveth not. But we may find worse opponents than even the Western scientist and Orientalist. If on the question of figures, Brahmins may agree with our teaching, we are not so sure that some of them, orthodox conservatives, may not raise objections to the modes of procreation attributed to their Pitar Devatas. We shall be called upon to produce the works from which we quote, while they will be invited by us to read their own Puranas a little more carefully and with an eye to the esoteric meaning. And then, we repeat again, they will find, under the veil of more or less transparent allegories, every statement made herein corroborated by their own works. One or two instances have already been given as regards the appearance of the second race, which is called the sweatborn. This allegory is regarded as a fairy tale, and yet it conceals a psychophysiological phenomenon and one of the greatest mysteries of nature. But, in view of the chronological statements made herein, it is natural to ask, could men exist 18 million years ago? To this, occultism answers in the affirmative, notwithstanding all scientific objectors. Moreover, this duration covers only the Vaivasvata Manu, man, in example, the male and female entity already separated in two distinct sexes. The 2.5 races that preceded that event may have lived 300 million years ago, for all that science can tell. For the geological and physical difficulties in the way of the theory could not exist for the primeval, ethereal man of the occult teachings. The whole issue of the quarrel between the profane and esoteric sciences depends upon the belief in and demonstration of the existence of an astral body within the physical, the former independent of the latter. Paul the Assia, the positivist, seems to have proven the fact pretty plainly. Footnote: Posthumous Humanity, translated by H.S. Alcott. I'm going to pop this one out to look at it for a reference later. We will pop right back over here. Okay. Has proven the fact pretty plainly, not to speak of the accumulated testimony of the ages, and that of the modern spiritualists and mystics. It will be found difficult to reject this fact in our age of proofs, tests, and ocular demonstrations. Not being familiar with what is contained in there, I'm not going to try to disprove it. The secret doctrine maintains that, notwithstanding the general cataclysms and disturbances of our globe, which, owing to its being the period of its greatest physical development, for the fourth round is the middle point of the life allotted to it, were far more terrible and intense than during any of the three preceding rounds. The cycle of its earlier psychic and spiritual life, and of its semi-ethereal conditions. Physical humanity has existed upon it for the last 18 million years. Footnote 2. Professor Newcomb says, the heat evolved by contraction would last only 18 million years. But a temperature permitting the existence of water could not be reached earlier than 10 million years ago. But Sir W. Thomson says that the whole age of the incrustation of the earth is 18 million years, though this year he has again altered his opinion and allows only 15 million years as the age of the sun. As will be shown in the addenda, the divergence of scientific opinions is so great that no reliance can ever be placed upon scientific speculation. Once again, we have the lens of history to look back through. There have been several instances of rapid deglaciation, any of which would have been allowing physical life upon the earth. 18 million years is a number, but it is not one that has very much veracity in actual application. Back to the text. This period was preceded by 300 million years of mineral and vegetable development. To this, all those who refuse to accept the theory of a boneless, purely ethereal man will object. Science, which knows only of physical organisms, will feel indignant, and materialistic theology more so. The first will object on logical and reasonable grounds, based on a preconception that all animate organisms have always existed on the same plane of materiality in all the ages. The last on a tissue of most absurd fictions. The ridiculous claim, usually brought forward by theologians, is based on the virtual assumption that mankind, read Christians, on this planet have the honor of being the only human beings in the whole cosmos who dwell on a globe, and that they are consequently the best of their kind. Footnote 3. The essay on The Plurality of Worlds, an anonymous work, yet well known to have been the production of Dr. Whewell, is a good proof of this. No Christian ought to believe in either the plurality of worlds, or the geological age of the globe, argues the author, because if it is asserted that this world is only one among the many of its kind, which are all the work of God, as it is itself, that all are the seat of life, all the realm of dwelling of intelligent creatures endowed with will, subject to law and capable of free will, then it would become extravagant to think that our world should have been the subject of God's favors and his special interference, of his communications and his personal visit. Can the earth presume to be considered the center of the moral and religious universe, he asks, if it has not the slightest distinction to rely upon in the physical universe? Is it not absurd to uphold such an assertion of the plurality of inhabited worlds as it would be today to uphold the old hypothesis of Ptolemy, who placed Earth in the center of our system? The above is quoted from memory, yet almost textually. The author fails to see that he is bursting his own soap bubble with such a defense. We've talked about that enough. The occultists, who believe firmly in the teachings of the mother philosophy, repel the objections of both theologians and scientists. They maintain on their side that during those periods when there must have been insufferable heat, even at the two poles, successive floods, upheavals of the valleys, and constant shifting of the great waters and seas, none of these circumstances could form an impediment to human life and organization, such as is assigned by them to the early mankind. Neither the heterogeneity of ambient regions, full of deleterious gases, nor the perils of a crust hardly consolidated, could prevent the first and second races from making their appearance even during the Carboniferous or the Silurian age itself. Thus, the monads, destined to animate future races, were ready for the new transformation. They had passed their phases of immetallization of plant and animal life from the lowest to the highest and were waiting for their human, more intelligent form. Yet, what could the plastic modelers do but follow the laws of evolutionary nature? Could they, as claimed by the biblical dead letter, form Lord God-like, or as Pygmalion in the Greek allegory, Adam Galatea, out of volcanic dust and breathe living soul into man? No, because the soul was already there, latent in its monad, and needing but a coating. Pygmalion, who fails to animate his statue, and Bahak Zivo of the Nazarene Gnostics, who fails to construct a human soul in the creature, are, as conceptions, far more philosophical and scientific than Adam, taken in the dead letter sense, or the biblical Elohim creators. Esoteric philosophy, which teaches spontaneous generation after the Shishta and Prajapati have thrown the seed of life on earth, show the lower angels able to construct physical man only, even with the help of nature, after having evolved the ethereal form out of themselves, and leaving the physical form to evolve gradually from its ethereal, or what would now be called protoplasmic, model. They will again be objected to, or this will again be objected to. Spontaneous generation is an exploded theory, we shall be told. Pasteur's experiments disposed of it 20 years ago, and Professor Tyndall is against it. Well, suppose he is. He ought to know that, should spontaneous generation be indeed proven impossible in our present world period and actual conditions, which the occultists deny, still it would be no demonstration that it could not have taken place under different cosmic conditions, not only in the seas of the Laurentinian period, but even on the then convulsed earth. It would be interesting to know how science could ever account for the appearance of species and life on earth, especially of man, once she rejects both the biblical teachings and spontaneous generation. Pasteur's observations, however, are far from being perfect or proven. Blanchard and Dr. Leutard reject their importance and show that they have none. The question is, so far, left sub judice, as well as that other one. When, at what period life appeared on the earth? As the idea that Haeckel's moneron, a pinch of salt, has solved the problem of the origin of life is simply absurd. Those materialists who feel inclined to pooh-pooh the theory of the self-existent, the self-born heavenly man, represented as an ethereal astral man, must excuse even a tyro in occultism laughing, in his turn, at some speculations of modern thought. After proving most learnedly that the primitive speck of protoplasm, moneron, is neither animal nor plant, but both, and that it has no ancestors among either of these, since it is that moneron which serves as a point of departure for all organized existence. We are, finally, told that the monera are their own ancestors. This may be very scientific, but it is very metaphysical also, too much so, even for the occultist. If spontaneous generation has changed its methods now, owing perhaps to accumulated material on hand, so as to almost escape detection, it was in full swing in the genesis of terrestrial life. Even the simple physical form and the evolution of species show how nature proceeds. The scale-bound, gigantic sauria, the winged pterodactyl, the megalosaurus, and the 100-feet-long iguanodon of the later period are the transformations of the earliest representatives of the animal kingdom found in the sediments of the primary epoch. There was a time when all those above enumerated antediluvian monsters appeared as filamentoid infusoria, without shell or crust, with neither nerves, muscles, organs, nor sex, and reproduced their kind by gemmation, as do microscopical animals also, the architects and builders of our mountain ranges, agreeably to the teachings of science. Why not man in this case? Why should he not have followed the same law in his growth, i.e., gradual condensation? Every unprejudiced person would prefer to believe that primeval humanity had at first an ethereal, or, if so preferred, a huge filamentoid, jelly-like form, evolved by gods or natural forces, which grew, condensed throughout millions of ages, and became gigantic in its physical impulse and tendency, until it settled into the huge physical form of the fourth race man. Rather than believe him created of the dust of the earth, literally, or from some unknown anthropoid ancestor. Nor does our esoteric theory clash with scientific data, except on first appearance, as Dr. A. Wilson, FRS, says in a letter to Knowledge. Evolution, rather nature in the light of evolution, has only been studied for some 25 years or so. That is, of course, a mere fractional space in the history of human thought. And, just because of that, we do not lose all hope that materialistic science will amend its ways and will gradually accept the esoteric teachings, even if, at first, divorced from their science to metaphysical elements. Has the last word on the subject of human evolution been said? Each answers the great question, man's real place in nature, invariably asserted by the followers of its propounder, if not by himself, to be complete and final, remains in high authority and esteem. It may be for 1 century, it may be for 20, writes Professor Huxley, but as invariably time proves each reply to have been a mere approximation to the truth, tolerable chiefly on account of the ignorance of those by whom it was accepted, and wholly intolerable when tested by the larger knowledge of their successors. Will this eminent Darwinian admit the possibility of his pithecoid ancestry being assignable to the list of wholly intolerable beliefs in the larger knowledge of occultists? But whence the savage, mere rising to the civilized state, does not account for the evolution of form. In the same letter, The Evolution of Man, Dr. Wilson makes other strange confessions. Thus, he observes, in answer to the queries put to knowledge by G.M., has evolution effected any change in man? If so, what change? If not, why not? If we refuse to admit, as science does, that man was created a perfect being, and then became degraded, there exists only another supposition, that of evolution. If man has arisen from a savage to a civilized state, that surely is evolution. We do not yet know, because such knowledge is difficult to acquire, if the human frame is subject to the same influences as those of lower animals. But there is little doubt that elevation from savagery to civilized life means and implies evolution, and that of considerable extent. Mentally, man's evolution cannot be doubted. The ever-widening sphere of thought has sprung from small and rude beginnings, like language itself, but man's ways of life, his power of adaptation to his surroundings, and countless other circumstances have made the facts and course of his evolution very difficult to trace. Again, microevolution works, macroevolution does not. This very difficulty ought to make the evolutionists more cautious in their affirmations. But why is evolution impossible if man was created a perfect being and then became degraded? At best, it can only apply to the outward physical man. As remarked in Isis Unveiled, Darwin's evolution begins at the middle point instead of commencing for man, as for everything else, from the universals. The Aristotle-Baconian method may have its advantages, but it has undeniably already demonstrated its defects. Pythagoras and Plato, who proceeded from the universals downward, are now shown more learned in the light of modern science than was Aristotle, for he opposed and denounced the idea of the revolution of the earth and even of its rotundity. Almost all those, he wrote, who affirm that they have studied heaven in its uniformity, claim that the earth is in the center, but the philosophers of the Italian school, otherwise called the Pythagoreans, teach entirely the contrary. Because A. the Pythagoreans were initiates, and B. they follow the deductive method, whereas Aristotle, the father of the inductive system, complained of those who taught that the center of our system was occupied by the sun, and the earth was only a star, by which a rotary motion around the same center produces night and day. The same with regard to man. The theory taught into the secret doctrine and now expanded is the only one which can, without falling into the absurdity of a miraculous man created out of the dust of the earth, or the still greater fallacy of man evolving from a pinch of lime salt, the ex-protoplasmic monoron, account for his appearance on earth. Not true. We've already hit that many times, and this is a long study. So analogy is the guiding law in nature, the only true Adrian's thread that can lead us through the inextricable path of her domain towards her primal and final mysteries. Nature, as a creative potency, is infinite, and no generation of physical scientists can ever boast of having exhausted the list of her ways and methods, however uniform the laws upon which she proceeds. If we can conceive of a ball of fire mist becoming, gradually, as it rolls through eons of time in the interstellar spaces, a planet, a self-luminous globe, to settle into a man-bearing world or earth, thus having passed from a soft plastic body into a rock-bound globe, and if we see on it everything evolving from the non-nucleated jelly speck that becomes the sarcode, footnote, or what is more generally known as protoplasm. This substance received its name of sarcode from Professor Dujardin-Beaumont's far earlier. The jelly speck that becomes the sarcode of the monoron then passes from its protistic state, footnote 2. The Monera are indeed protista. They are neither animals nor plants, writes Haeckel. The whole body of the monoron represents nothing more than a single, thoroughly homogeneous particle of albumin in a firmly adhesive condition. I am assuming that we are talking about like single-celled organisms, right? That's what I'm assuming here. I'm unfamiliar with these words, right? Sarcon I'm not familiar with. Protoplasm I am. And so, from its protistic state into the form of an animal to grow into a gigantic reptilian monster of the Mesozoic times, then dwindles again into the comparatively dwarfish crocodile, now confined solely to tropical regions, and the universally common lizard. Footnote: behold the iguanodon of the Mesozoic ages, the monster 100 feet long, now transformed into the small iguana lizard of South America. Popular traditions about giants in the days of old, and their mention in every mythology, including the Bible, may someday to be shown to be founded on fact. In nature, the logic of analogy alone ought to make us accept these traditions as scientific verities. And the universally common lizard. How can man alone escape the general law? There were giants on earth in those days, says Genesis, repeating the statement of all other Eastern scriptures. And the Titans are founded on anthropological and physiological fact. And, as the hard-shelled crustacean was once upon a time a jelly speck, a thoroughly homogeneous particle of albumin in a firmly adhesive condition, so was the outward covering of primitive man, his early coat of skin, plus an immortal spiritual monad and a psychic temporary form and body within that shell. The modern, hard, muscular man, almost impervious to any climate, was perhaps some 25 million years ago just what the Hegelian moneron is, strictly an organism without organs, an entirely homogeneous substance with a structureless albumin body within, and a human form only outwardly. I want to pause real quick and talk about this, right? Hard, muscular, and almost impervious to any climate is not true, right? There is a very, very narrow window of opportunity for man to survive without interference, right? If the temperature is consistently below 65 degrees, you will develop hypothermia if you do not have fire or insulation. You will die. If the temperature is consistently over 100 degrees, you will die. You will not be able to consistently tolerate those temperatures, right? So if you are exposed to 100-degree temperatures for the entirety of a day, you are probably going to have heat stroke and die without interventionary procedures. So if you are not in the shade of a tree at a minimum, you are going to die from these extreme temperatures. I don't understand why that is hard to conceive. You can freeze to death in relatively warm conditions. You can burn to death in relatively benign conditions. We are not, by any stretch of the imagination, almost impervious to any climate. At all. Can we survive? Yes, through technology, and only through technology. So this right here is simply fallacious. Back to the text. No man of science has the right in this century to find the figures of the Brahmins preposterous in the question of chronology, for their own calculations often exceed by far the claim made by esoteric science. This may easily be shown. Let's see. Helmholtz calculated that the cooling of our Earth from a temperature of 2,000 degrees to 200 degrees centigrade must have occupied a period of no less than 350 million years. That was a guess. I do not know where we currently stand in accordance with that guess, but I am assuming that it is different. Western science, including geology, seems generally to allow our globe an age of about 500 million years altogether. That has definitely been adjusted. We are in the billions of years now for most of the estimations. That's not saying that they are correct, but it has definitely been adjusted. Sir W. Thompson, however, limits the appearance of the earliest vegetable life to 100 million years ago, a statement respectfully contradicted by the archaic records. No, it is right. If it was to be contradicted by the archaic records, it would be from records that are of that age, verifiably, right? Whether that's carbon dating or some other form of dating, it would be verifiably older than 4,000 years old, which is the age of the oldest recorded anything, right? Outside of cave paintings. Like any literature whatsoever that has been recorded is within the last 4,000 years, period, the end. And so there were speculations that it was older. Those are fine. That does not mean that it was fact. A statement respectfully contradicted means that it is factually proven, not speculative. Speculations, furthermore, vary daily in the domain of science. That is because science was very much at this point in time just figuring out anything, right? This was 1888. Meanwhile, some geologists are very much opposed to such limitation. Volga calculates the time requisite for the deposit of the strata known to us must have at least amounted to 648 millions of years. Both time and space are infinite and eternal. The Earth, as a material existence, is indeed infinite. The changes only which it has undergone can be determined by finite periods of time. Burmeister. We must therefore assume that the starry heaven is not merely in space, which no astronomer doubts, but also in time, without beginning or end, that it never was created and is imperishable. See Solby, footnote 2. Force and Matter by L. Buchner. Zolby repeats exactly what the occultists say, but the Aryan occultists, we may be told, know nothing of these later speculations. They were even ignorant of the globular form of our Earth. Coleman. To this, Vishnu Purana contains a reply which has forced certain Orientalists to open their eyes very widely. The sun is stationed for all time in the middle of the day and over against midnight in all the Dvipas, continents, Maitreya, but the rising and the setting of the sun being perpetually opposite to each other, and in the same way all the cardinal points, and so the cross points. Maitreya, people speak of the rising of the sun where they see it, and where the sun disappears. There, to them, is his setting. Of the sun, which is always in the one and the same place, there is neither setting nor rising, for what is called rising and setting are only the seeing and the not seeing of the sun. That is mostly true, but the sun is moving as well. If you are unaware, that is a truth. To this, Fitz-Edward Hall remarks, the heliocentrism taught in the passage is remarkable. It is contradicted, however, a little further on. Contradicted purposely, because it was a secret temple teaching. Martin Hogg remarked the same teaching in another passage. It is useless to calumniate the Aryans any longer. To return to the chronology of the geologist and anthropologist, we are afraid science has no reasonable grounds on which she could oppose the views of the occultist in this direction, except that, of man, the highest organic being of creation, not a trace was found in the primary strata. Only in the uppermost, the so-called alluvial layer, is all that can be urged so far. That man was not the last member in the mammalian family, but the first in this round, is something that science will be forced to acknowledge one day. A similar view, also, has already been mooted in France on very high authority. That man can be shown to have lived in the mid-tertiary period and in a geological age when there did not yet exist one single specimen of the now known species of mammals, is a statement that science cannot deny, and which has now been proven by de Quatrefages. Footnote. I am interested in that. Introduction. Okay. But, even supposing his existence in the Eocene period is not yet demonstrated, what period of time has elapsed since the Cretaceous period? We are aware of the fact that only the boldest geologists dare to place man further back than the Miocene age. But, how long, we ask, is the duration of those ages and periods since the Mesozoic time? On this, after a good deal of speculation and wrangling, science is silent, the greatest authorities upon the subject being compelled to answer the question. We do not know. This ought to show that the men of science are no greater authorities in this matter than are the profane. Then, not necessarily now. If, according to Professor Huxley, the time represented by coal formation would be 6 millions of years, modern science and modern thought, how many more millions would be required to cover the time from the Jurassic period, or the middle, of the so-called reptilian age, when the third race appeared, up to the Miocene, when the bulk of the fourth race was submerged? Footnote. Esoteric Buddhism. The writer is well aware that those specialists whose computations of the ages of the globe and man are the most liberal always had the shire majority against them. But this proves very little, since the majority rarely, if ever, turns out to be right in the long run. Harvey stood alone for many years. The advocates for crossing the Atlantic with steamers were in danger of ending their days in a lunatic asylum. Mesmer is classed to this day in the encyclopedias, along with Cagliostro and Saint Germain, as a charlatan and impostor. And now that Messrs. Charcot and Richet have vindicated Mesmer's claims, and that mesmerism, under its new name of hypnotism, a false nose on a very old face, is accepted by science, it does not strengthen one's respect for that majority when one sees the ease and unconcern with which its members treat of hypnotism, telepathic impacts, and its other phenomena. They speak of it, in short, as if they had believed in it since the days of Solomon and had never called its votaries, only a few years ago, lunatics and impostors. Footnote 2. The same fate is in store for spiritualistic phenomena and all the other psychological manifestations of the inner man. Since the days of Hume, whose researches culminated in a nihilistic idealism, psychology has gradually shifted its position to one of crass materialism. Hume is regarded as a psychologist, and yet he denied a priori the possibility of phenomena in which millions now believe, including many men of science. The hylo-idealists of today are rank annihilationists. The schools of Spencer and Bain are respectively positivist and materialist, and not metaphysical at all. It is psychism and not psychology. It reminds one as little of the Vedantic teaching as the pessimism of Schopenhauer and von Hartmann recalls the esoteric philosophy, the heart and soul of true Buddhism. The same revulsion of thought is in store for the long periods of years claimed by esoteric philosophy as the age of sexual and physiological mankind. Therefore, even the stanza which says, "The mind-born, the boneless, gave being to the will-born with bones," adding that this took place in the middle of the third race 18 million years ago, has yet a chance of being accepted by future scientists. As far as 19th century thought is concerned, we shall be told, even by some personal friends who are imbued with an abnormal respect for the shifting conclusions of science, that such a statement is absurd. how much more improbable will appear our further assertion to the effect that the antiquity of the first race dates back millions of years beyond this again. For, although the exact figures are withheld, it is out of the question to refer to the incipient evolution of the primeval divine races with certainty to either the early secondary or the primary ages of geology. One thing is clear, that the figures, 18 millions of years, which embrace the duration of sexual physical man, have to be enormously increased if the whole process of spiritual, astral, and physical development is taken into account. Many geologists, indeed, consider that the duration of the Quaternary and Tertiary ages demands the concession of such an estimate, and it is quite certain that no terrestrial conditions, whatever negative the hypothesis of an Eocene man, if evidence for his reality is forthcoming. Occultists, who maintain that the above date carries us far back into the secondary or reptilian age, may refer to Monsieur de Quatrefages in support of the possible existence of man in that remote antiquity. But with regard to the earliest root races, the case is very different. If the thick agglomeration of vapors charged with carbonic acid that escaped from the soil or was held in suspension in the atmosphere since the commencement of sedimentation offered a fatal obstacle to the life of human organisms as now known, how, it will be asked, could the primeval men have existed? The consideration is in reality out of court. Such terrestrial conditions as were then operative had no touch with the plane on which the evolution of the ethereal astral races proceeded. Only in relatively recent geological periods has the spiral course of cyclic law swept mankind into the lowest grade of physical evolution, the plane of gross material causation. In those early ages, astral evolution was alone in progress, and the two planes, the astral and the physical, though developing on parallel lines, had no direct point of contact with one another. It is obvious that a shadow-like ethereal man is related by virtue of his organization, if such it can be called, only to that plane from which the substance of his upadi is derived. There are things, perhaps, that may have escaped the far-seeing but not all-seeing eyes of our modern naturalist. Yet it is nature herself who undertakes to furnish the missing links. Agnostic, speculative thinkers have to choose between the version given by the secret doctrine of the East and the hopelessly materialistic Darwinian and biblical accounts of the origin of man, between no soul and no spiritual evolution, and the occult doctrine which repudiates special creation and the evolutionist anthropogenesis equally. Again, to take up the question of spontaneous generation, life, as science shows, has not always reigned on this terrestrial plane. There was a time when even the Hegelian moneron, that simple globule of protoplasm, had not yet appeared at the bottom of the seas. Whence came the impulse which caused the molecules of carbon, nitrogen, oxygen, etc., to group themselves into the Ersklium of Okean, that organic slime now christened protoplasm? What were the prototypes of the Monera? They, at least, could not have fallen in meteorites from other globes already formed, Sir W. Thomson's wild theory to this effect notwithstanding. And if they have so fallen, if our Earth got its supply of life germs from other planets, who or what had carried them into those planets? Here, again, unless the occult teaching is accepted, we are compelled once more to face a miracle, to accept the theory of a personal, anthropomorphic creator, the attributes and definitions of whom, as formulated by the monotheist, class as much with the philosophy and logic as they degrade the ideal of an infinite universal deity, before whose incomprehensible awful grandeur the highest human intellect feels dwarfed. Let not the modern philosopher, while arbitrarily placing himself on the highest pinnacle of human intellectuality hitherto evolved, show himself spiritually and intuitionally so far below the conceptions of even the ancient Greeks, themselves on a far lower level in these respects than the philosophers of the Eastern Aryan antiquity. Hylozoism, when philosophically understood, is the highest aspect of pantheism. It is the only possible escape from idiotic atheism based on lethal materiality, and the still more idiotic anthropomorphic conceptions of the monotheist, between which two it stands on its own entirely neutral ground. Hylozoism demands absolute divine thought, which would pervade the numberless active creating forces, or creators, which entities are moved by and have their being in, from, and through that divine thought. The latter, nevertheless, having no more personal concern in them or their creations than the sun has in the sunflower and its seeds, or in vegetation in general. Such active creators are known to exist and are believed in because perceived and sensed by the inner man in the occultist. Thus, the latter says that an absolute deity, having to be unconditioned and unrelated, cannot be thought of at the same time as an active creating one living God without immediate degradation of the ideal. That is true. Footnote. The conception and definition of absolute by Cardinal Cusa may satisfy only the Western mind, prisoned so unconsciously to itself, and entirely degenerated by long centuries of scholastic and theological sophistry. But this recent philosophy of the absolute, traced by Sir W. Hamilton to Cusa, would never satisfy the more acutely metaphysical mind of the Hindu Vedantin. Now, I said that this is true, and that is because of another study that I am doing, which is The Science of Logic by George Hegel, in which he makes the point right at the beginning. If you put any definition whatsoever upon the infinite, you are limiting it, right? If you go just as far as to say the universe is infinite and ever expanding, by saying that it is ever expanding, you imply motion, which implies that it is moving somewheres outside of itself, and therefore you have placed a limit upon the infinite, making it the finite. It is a very good argument. He is absolutely correct in his argument, and it is the same thing as this. Right? If you are putting God waiting to judge you on the infinite, you are limiting God to some dude waiting to judge you. Back to the text. A deity that manifests in space and time, these two being simply the forms of that which is the absolute all, can be but a fractional part of the whole. And since that all cannot be divided into its absoluteness, therefore that sensed creator, we say creators, can be at best but the mere aspect thereof. To use the same metaphor, inadequate to express the full idea, yet well adapted to the case in hand, these creators are like the numerous rays of the solar orb, which remains unconscious of and unconcerned in the work, while its mediating agents, the rays, become the instrumental media every spring, the manvanteric dawn of the earth, in fructifying and awakening the dormant vitality inherent in nature and its differentiated matter. This was so well understood in antiquity that even the moderately religious Aristotle remarked that such work of direct creation would be quite unbecoming to God. Plato and other philosophers taught the same. Deity cannot set its own hand to creation. This Cudworth calls hylozoism, as old Zeno is credited by Laertius with having said, "Nature is a habit moved from itself according to seminal principles, perfecting and containing those several things which in determinate times are produced from it, and acting agreeably to that from which it was secreted." Footnote. Cudworth's intellectual system. Let us return to our subject, pausing to think over it. If, indeed, if there was vegetable life during those periods that could feed on these then deleterious elements, and if there was even animal life whose aquatic organization could be developed, notwithstanding the supposed scarcity of oxygen, why could there not be human life also in its incipient physical form? An example, in a race of beings adapted for that geological period and its surroundings. Besides, science confesses that it knows nothing of the real length of geological periods. But the chief question before us is whether it is quite certain that, from the time of that which is called the Azoic Age, there ever was such an atmosphere as that hypothesized by the naturalists. Not all the physicists agree with this idea. Were the writer anxious to corroborate the teachings of the secret doctrine by exact science, it would be easy to show, on the admission of more than one physicist, that the atmosphere has changed little, if at all, since the first condensation of the oceans. An example, since the Laurentinian period, the Pyrolithic Age. Such, at any rate, is the opinion of Blanchard, S. Menure, and of Birchoff, as the experiments of the latter science with basalts has shown. 4. Were we to take the word of the majority of scientists as to the quantity of deadly gases and of elements entirely saturated with carbon and nitrogen, in which the vegetable and animal kingdoms are shown to have lived, thriven, and developed, then one would have to come to the curious conclusion that there were, in those days, oceans of liquid carbonic acid instead of water. With such an element, it becomes doubtful whether the ganoids, or even the primitive trilobites themselves, could live in the oceans of the primary age, let alone in those of the Silurian, as shown by Blanchard. The conditions that were necessary for the earliest race of mankind, however, require no elements, whether simple or compound. That which was stated at the beginning is maintained. The spiritual, ethereal entity which lived in spaces unknown to Earth, before the first sidereal jelly speck evolved in the ocean of crude cosmic matter billions and trillions of years before our globular speck in infinity, called Earth, came into being and generated the moneron in its drops, called oceans, needed no elements. The Manu with soft bones could well dispense with calcic phosphate, as he had no bones, save in a figurative sense. And while even the Monera, however homogeneous their organism, still required physical conditions of life that would help them towards further evolution, the being which became primitive man and the father of man, after evolving on planes of existence undreamt of by science, could well remain impervious to any state of atmospheric conditions around him. The primitive ancestor in Brasseur de Bourbourg's Popol Vuh, who, in the Mexican legends, could act and live with equal ease underground and water as upon the earth, answers only to the second and early third races in our text. And if the three kingdoms of nature were so different in pre-Diluvian ages, why should not man have been composed of materials and combinations of atoms now entirely unknown to physical science? the plants and animals, now known in almost numberless varieties and species, have all developed, according to scientific hypotheses, from primitive and far fewer organic forms. Why should not the same have occurred in the case of man, the elements, and the rest? Universal Genesis starts from 1, breaks into 3, then 5, and finally culminates into 7, to return into 4, 3, and 1. Commentary. For additional proofs, consult Part 2 of this volume, The Septenary in Nature. And that is going to bring us to the end of the evolution of the sweat-born. Hopefully I brought a little bit of enlightenment and not too much confusion to some very complicated topics. I understand that I hold some unconventional beliefs, and I have a tendency to step on toes when I relay those. It is not intentional, but it is not something I apologize for. Dividing what is from what isn't is important, especially if you're going to be dealing with actual things. Now, I have many unconventional beliefs. I have detailed them and why I believe them many times, and this in part is me searching for either confirmations or outright denials of the things which I believe. I have found nothing in this that is necessarily evidentially opposed to my theories. Some of them seem to be a little bit, well, they are naturally opposed, I guess. So they are, to me, a little bit wild, but not necessarily something that could not have been, right? These ethereal bodies, we have no reason to believe that that is true. But I believe in the entities, right? I believe that there are entities beyond the incorporation which we are aware of. And so it is entirely possible that there were these things. That does not necessarily mean, even if they are true, that they had anything to do with us. It's possible. It is equally possible that they did not. The method by which I have proposed that the macroevolutionary process could have taken place, that's as equally plausible as anything else pointed out. And so hopefully I've been a little bit clarifying and not too confusing about these things. It is important for me to do these studies. It is important for me to separate the speculation from the probable and from the verifiably true, simply for my own benefit and for you. So if you like what I'm doing over here, let me know down below. Give me a like, a share, a follow. Throw me a comment if you agree or disagree with anything that I said or that is written in the book. Drop it in the comments down below, and if it remains respectful, it gets to remain up. If you have another work you would like to see me discuss, drop that in the comments as well. And if you really like what I'm doing, hit me with that super thanks or even a membership. It will be greatly appreciated. To the crew, thanks for hanging out. I appreciate every single minute that you are here with me, and I am praying for you every single day. Until next time, I love you. God loves you. You are perfect, whole, and complete just the way that you are. And this has been Pitt's Take. Peace.